Here we are. We got into 4. I think we're pretty much finished with chapter 4, or I guess syllabus section 4, and working our way through 5. We'll get through that, and we'll get through land use control and environmental probably tonight. We might touch on agency tonight. We'll see what happens. But we're just working our way through the book in order. Nope, no, we're not. This book is a little shifted from the actual syllabus. We're going in order of the syllabus, and here's how it relates to the book. So syllabus 4 does indeed fit up with 4 in the textbook, as well as chapter 5. Then it gets weird. Chapter 5, part of syllabus 4. Syllabus 5 is actually chapter 6. Syllabus 7, nope, no, that's it. Then I just need to readjust. Oh, yeah, okay. Sorry, I promise I haven't been drinking. Just bear with me. We're going in order of the syllabus. Let's just leave it at that. Okay. Let's look at 4 again. There we go. Oh, sorry. Here we go. There we are. Now we're in good shape. So let's look back through 4 a little bit and see what we talked about. We got into transferring property. The word for that is alienation, because we're alienating ourselves from the property. So just another $2 real estate term to keep track of. We talked about describing property. Do you remember what the most favored way to describe property in North Carolina is? What's the most favored way for a proper legal description in North Carolina? Tell me in the chat, please. Or you can speak up. There we go. Thank you very much. Yeah, meets and bounds. And it's weird. It's that paragraph kind of a thing. But it's one of 3. One of 3 proper legal descriptions that is used in North Carolina. The others are a reference to a previously recorded deed for the same property. Also, a reference to a recorded plat map, the actual survey-looking plat map of a property. So those are the North Carolina ones. We also studied the government rectangular survey, but that is not a North Carolina method. You will be tested on it to some degree, but that's going to show up on the national portion of the exam. So don't forget, both the class exam and the PSI exam are given to you in 2 pieces, a national portion and a state portion. National portion will come first in both cases. You'll finish that. You'll go on to the state one. So I kind of wish they'd flip it, because I feel like the state one deserves a fresher perspective, nice and fresh and ready to take the test. But national comes first. So here's meets and bounds. It's a paragraph, and then it coincides with sometimes a survey. And key terms related to meets and bounds, thank you, include monuments. Monuments are where those directions change. What are some other terms associated with meets and bounds? What are the other terms affiliated with that? That's how they like to ask these particular questions on this topic. They don't make you draw one or write one. They just want to know what terms are associated. So the point of beginning is also the same and must be the same as the point of ending, so that it becomes a closed shape. You end where you started. And then we've got distance and direction. That's what the meets and bounds is talking about. Then we get into the government rectangular survey method. And that was done across the country, not including Texas or the original 13 colonies. So every other state is done this way. The Old West. If you're seeing my slides small, you can hover over my video square and click on the three dots and pin me to the first screen. That'll make it so that you can see that the slides is primary. If I share it, the Zoom share, it'll probably look fuzzy because Zoom has pretty low resolution and bandwidth. So I'm trying not to share it via Zoom for that reason. And then if I make it spotlit from my end, I can't see all of you. So that's the best way, is to pin to the screen. Let me just double check that and see if I can. Yeah, that's the problem. If I spotlight it, it's going to take away the whole screen of all of your faces, and I need to see those. So go to my little block there, find the triple dots, probably next to something that says mute as well. Click on the triple dots. You'll have a drop-down menu and choose pin to first screen or pin to screen, something like that. So the government rectangular survey system was very uniform, right? It was a grid system. And so if the test asked you what terms are associated with that, it would be these words. The vertical lines, the purple ones on this shot, are meridians and ranges. Range lines and meridian lines. Those go north and south. Then the east and west ones are called tiers and baselines, both of them, both of those words. And then what you're creating with this square is a township that's 6 miles by 6 miles. Each of those townships are divided into sections that are 1 mile by 1 mile, so there become 36 total sections in a township there on the left. Within that township, they're laid out the same way, every town. So section 16 was determined to be where the government buildings are, including the schoolhouse or the sheriff's office, police station, or as I guess towns got bigger, they got more of a need for more government buildings, but they tried to put them in the block 16. So anytime you went into a town, you knew where to find those things. Here's what it looks like to refer to a prior recorded deed. This is what a deed looks like, at least the first page. And so to refer to it is going to be something called a book and page number. Find the deed in deed book 357 in Cabarrus County on page 917. It'd be something like that. So when you see book and page, it's pointing you into the Register of Deeds office to find a deed or some other document that has been recorded. If it's referencing a prior plat that's been recorded, it's going to refer you to a block and a lot number. So in this case, block E is this road down here at the bottom, and lot 15 is the blue one. So any of those three, meets and bounds, reference to a prior recorded deed, and reference to a recorded plat map, are good legal descriptions that North Carolina recognizes. But of course, on the MLS, in life, when you mail something to somebody, you're going to use the street address, and we include those too. It's just that they're not considered proper legal descriptions. They're just informal descriptions. Same for the tax parcel ID. That's an informal description as well. So that's not good enough to be put on a deed when you're conveying or transferring property to someone else. A really good document to use in identifying property and showing how the layout of the property fits onto the lot is a survey. But we as brokers should not give any advice about the survey. Don't try to interpret this thing and tell somebody what it means. Much as you want to be helpful, That's beyond our scope. We would say, hey, let's talk to the surveyor about that question, or let's talk to the attorney. Just don't you do it, because we shouldn't give survey advice. That'd be called interpreting the survey. Talked about some more terminology. Of course, alienation is transferring the property. Doing it voluntarily means you made a choice. You're either choosing to sell it or you're choosing to give it away. And then doing it involuntarily means they're taking it from you, or court action or foreclosure. Something like that is causing your property to be transferred from you to someone else. When it comes to probate or someone dying, and in that case, alienating themselves from their property because they're dead, if someone dies with a will, they will often name an executor or an executrix of their estate. That's the person that carries out their wishes as they've spelled out within the will. And they open probate with the city government and say, okay, let's let the whole world know this person has died. Let's make sure that no creditors are owed any money by them, because we have to give them a 30-day window for those creditors to come forth and say, yep, she owed me money. And so we would pay that out if they could prove it properly from their assets before those assets are given to whoever that person was leaving them to. And whoever does receive those assets is called the beneficiary. Beneficiary receives the property. It's more than just real estate. It could be money, cars, collectibles. A couple more important words: testate and intestate. So when somebody dies with a will, it's called dying testate. That means they had a will when they died. And so therefore, in their will, they're saying how they want their property to be passed down. And that's a form of voluntary alienation. Dying without a will is called intestate. And that would be a form of involuntary alienation, because if the government can't find a will because they don't have one, they didn't leave one, and there's no heirs to leave the property to, then the state of North Carolina is going to take it, which is another word you need to know called escheat, the lower right of the frame there. So 3 important words here: testate, intestate, and escheat. Those are easy points to get on the test. I've seen practice exam question just yesterday, and it had all 3 of these words as answer choices. None of these were the answer, but if you knew what these words meant, you could have weeded them out and then gotten the 4th word as the answer. So knowing the definitions can really help you, even if you're not quite 100% on what the test question is asking. If you can rule out some answer choices because you know for sure that this doesn't even have to do with what you're asking about, that can really save you and get you those points. So, of course, voluntary alienation means the owner's choosing, right? They're doing it intentionally, selling or giving it. Involuntary means it's against their wishes. They're not happy about this. Court-ordered, foreclosure, something like that. Because when you get a loan, as we'll see when we get to that chapter, you actually, as the borrower, are signing a document called the deed of trust, which gives the property up as collateral for the loan. If you don't pay the loan, you lose the property because that's the collateral you put up for it. And basically, if you don't pay, you don't stay, right? So that lender has gotten you to agree to this. Otherwise, they wouldn't have loaned you the money if you didn't agree to sign the deed of trust. So that's the result. You don't pay, the foreclosure can happen. We also saw this kind of strange idea called adverse possession. What kind of alienation would be happening if adverse possession took place? Voluntary or involuntary? Yeah, because what's happening here with adverse possession? Yeah. And they hope to eventually do what? Yeah. They're using it openly, continuously, exclusively, adversely, notoriously. And if they can do it continuously for 20 years, if the property does not have any sort of cloud against the title, then they could have a shot at petitioning the court to give it to them. If the property does happen to have a cloud, they only need to use it this way for 7 years. But that doesn't include government property. It's only for private property. We talked about this other version of involuntary alienation, missed one, eminent domain. And eminent domain means the government has decided that taking all or part of your property for the good of the public is warranted. They still have to pay you fair compensation for it. They'd have it appraised, say, hey, we're going to give you this amount of money for your property because we're pretty much need it to make this road 4 lanes instead of 2, or whatever the case may be. If the owner does not agree, the government could go to court, take them to court over it and say, okay, then we are suing you for condemnation. We're basically going to make you sell it, make you sell a portion of your property through this eminent domain. So eminent domain includes this potential process called condemnation. The condemnation may not need to happen if you agree to take the money for giving up the property as they intended, but if you fight them over it, they could still condemn the property and take it anyway. They'd still have to pay you for it, but that condemnation is the due process portion of this procedure. We also got into what makes a deed valid. And this I could see being kind of confusing because there are some more things that happen to a deed and get included in a deed. We've already talked about how the deed needs to be recorded, but notice recording the deed is a non-essential element. But all that means is whether the deed is recorded or not does not affect whether it's a valid deed. It could still be valid even if it's not recorded. The reason it needs to be recorded is a sort of a different reason altogether. But these are the only things that are required in order for this deed to be considered a valid deed. Must be in writing. If things aren't in writing, they're not enforceable. So let's get it in writing so that we can take somebody to the court of law if we need to enforce it. The one selling, the grantor, must have legal capacity, be 18, sane and sober. Both parties need to be named, but only one party signs it. And that's the one who's selling it or the giving it or the grantor. And it also needs to spell out in that deed adequate words of conveyance. What is happening with this deed? Somebody's selling it to someone else? Is somebody gifting it to someone else? And then also an essential element of a valid deed is that it is delivered to the grantee and voluntarily accepted by the grantee. But the grantee doesn't actually sign the deed in order to make it valid. Only signer of the deed is the one giving it. And then things that don't make it a valid deed but are still probably going to be on there are these. These are non-essential elements, but most all of them are on deeds typically. It's dated, it's witnessed by someone, it's recorded for other reasons so that we can consider it closed and therefore disperse the funds to the seller and to the brokers and give the keys to the buyer. It's also notarized by a notary public, but it doesn't have to be, again, in order to be considered valid. It's just a good idea that these things are done, so they are. There's not necessarily an exact amount of consideration, like the purchase price is not necessarily mentioned on the deed. What is mentioned on the deed are the excise tax, or the revenue stamps. Excise tax is what we learned it to be. It's sealed, and then again, the grantee is not one of the signers of the deed. We learned that there are different kinds of deeds, and the very best kind that gives the most promises, the most protections from the seller to the buyer is the general warranty deed, because that comes with 5 protections or 5 covenants or warranties. It says, hey, I'm giving this to you, or I'm selling this to you, and I promise this is mine to give. Nobody else can say they own it. It's mine, and I will give it to you in exchange for this amount of money. or consideration or whatever that may be. I'm also giving it to you free of any liens. But we have learned that you could sell a property with liens attached to it. And so if that's the case, you're selling the property to somebody and it has liens on it, then we can't sell it to them with a general warranty deed, can we? We'd have to use a different kind of deed, probably a special warranty deed, because that one is only 2 warranties, not all 5. But the general warranty one says no liens. We'll get them all. Even if there are some, we'll clear them up at the very latest by closing day. You won't have this property with liens attached. The covenant of quiet enjoyment says that no other person, no third party that's not known will come forth and claim they own it. Further assurance means if that does happen, or if any other sort of complication happens, I will help you get it cleared up later. Even after I sell it to you, I'll come back. I'll still be involved and try to help you get it squared away, track down information if needed. And if I'm dead or if I'm too broke to resolve something that might pop up later, that's where the title insurance kicks in. We talked about title insurance. Warranty forever. Even after the sale is done, I still stand behind it. That's how strong a general warranty deed is. Special warranty deed is not the same. General warranty says I'll stand behind, defend the title forever and ever, from the past to the present to the future. But the special warranty deed says I'm only going to guarantee this deed for the time that I owned it. I didn't do anything to screw it up, but I don't know what the last person might have done. So fair warning, basically. Might see a quit claim deed, and that means I'm not giving you any promises at all. I'll just sell you the property, and it's your risk. May or may not have claim to the title and no guarantees. Compare that to a bargain and sale deed, no guarantees, but does have claim to the title. But usually this is something that's used to just clear up a cloud on the title. We got into some specialty deeds. The ones in yellow tend to be related to like a foreclosure or court sort of activity. Then we got into excise tax. That was an easy calculation. We just divide by 500, the sale price divided by 500, because it's essentially a sales tax. So the thing that you could get confused about with this is, since it's a tax, you might think you need to use the tax value. We've used the tax value in the past. We used it to calculate the annual taxes, but this is not that. The annual taxes is what you pay every year while you own the property. The excise tax, which is what we're looking at here, is what you pay when you sell the property one time. You're paying it because you're selling it. And this, therefore, is based on the purchase price. My favorite method is the one on the right. Take the purchase price, divide by 500. That might give you some dollars and cents. And if it does, you just round up to the next dollar. That's the other big thing about excise tax. It's always rounded to the next dollar. Then we got into the title insurance or title search process, where the attorney checks back through something called the grantee index, making sure that this seller bought it from a certain person and they bought it from a person and they bought it from a person. No gaps, no missing links in that chain of title, clearly bought and sold down the line. And how far back, how many years back do you need to go? You got it. 30 years. It's called the Marketable Title Act. Marketable Title Act says if any nonsense happened more than 30 years ago, don't worry about it. You just need to search back 30 years. Let me check on that question for you, Catherine. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to do that. Let me double check and I'll get back to you. Some states have this one. It's called an abstract of title. We don't do that in North Carolina, but it's basically a very detailed and chronological history of the title, but not something we do here. And so the purpose of title insurance is to protect two people. If you're getting a loan, it's protecting the lender as well as the buyer due to any sort of defect from a loss because of any sort of defect in that title. And so we could say that title insurance is the best title assurance. So if we're buying a separate policy, one for the lender and one for the buyer ourselves when we're buying it, what do those policies cover? Like, how much do they cover? And that's what this is about. There's an owner's policy that covers the value of the property itself. There's a lender's policy that covers the loan amount. And then remember, that loan amount changes with every payment. It comes down. So eventually that lender's policy will no longer be needed when that loan is no longer in place. The loan gets paid off, the lender's title policy no longer needed. So that one runs out. Another important piece of legislation is called the Connor Act. And this is just a list of documents that should be recorded in order to protect against other people coming in and laying claim to them. So the Connor Act says a document must be recorded to protect against third-party claims. And these are those documents: deeds, restrictive covenants, easements, assignments, mortgages, options to purchase, installment land contract, and leases if they're longer than 3 years. That installment land contract is basically seller financing. I know I'm going through this fast, but this is a review. We covered all this last week, and it's still in that live stream there on the YouTube channel. We also covered how if you sign over a deed to someone, the first person to record it at the courthouse is the one who gets it, right? If someone were to try to sell the same property to two different people, the one who recorded first is the one who's actually going to end up with the property. Of course, the seller would be in trouble if they tried that, but the first one who records wins. So recording a document means going to the courthouse, putting it on the public record, paying a couple of bucks, like 20, 30, 40 bucks, and now that document is on the public record, available to the whole world to look it up. Everybody right here in this little room, Zoom space we're in, can go to a county of your choice, look up Register of Deeds office, and do searches for various deeds, options to purchase, all that whole list, assignments, mortgages, easements. Two of the more common documents that get recorded, especially as we're learning in this class, are, well, 3: deeds, deeds of trust, and restrictive covenants. Those are pretty popular, pretty typical that you run into on the daily out there in the real estate world. What do I mean by a deed of trust? We haven't gotten to that chapter, but I've talked about it a minute. It's different than a deed. What's the difference? A deed versus a deed of trust. That's an easy one to mess up. The test question might be confusing if it asks you it in a certain way. So yeah, Holly makes a good point. It's basically the mortgage. It's the thing that says if you don't pay, you don't stay. You're pledging the property as collateral for the loan. So the deed of trust is the same thing as what a mortgage is, and that gets recorded. So we'll get into that when we get to, I think, 14 and 15. That's the Register of Deeds office, is where these recordings take place, and you can access them online, or you can go in person. And then in North Carolina, the documents, the deed of trust and the deed especially, needs to be recorded in order for that settlement meeting to turn into a closing, for that settlement day to turn into a closing day. Because as we'll see in chapter 9, the contract says, when are we going to have a settlement? Fill in the blank with a date. It doesn't say when are we going to close, even though that's the term everybody's used to using. Settlement is when everybody's signing papers, but only until the deed gets recorded has that closing happened. So we'll dig more into that then. Here's our Marketable Title Act again. Searching back 30 years, anything beyond 30 that might be a serious defect or a lien or a question of law or fact, any sort of other person that comes along before then claims ownership, none of that matters, as long as it was more than 30 years ago. There are some documents that don't get recorded. They like to test you on this one too. So while a deed of trust, an assignment, restrictive covenants in the neighborhood, those sorts of things get recorded, these three do not. A contract for sale, that's not something that's public record. That's just between the buyer and the seller. That doesn't get recorded. A promissory note, that's something that a borrower signs when they sign the deed of trust. They go hand in hand because the lender is loaning you money and the terms of the loan are spelled out in the promissory note, but it's not for the public to know about. It's not public record. Promissory note has the loan amount, the interest rate you're paying, your payments on, how much your payments are, that sort of thing. But then the thing that stands behind the promissory note and basically holds your feet to the fire and makes you scared to not pay your loan is the deed of trust. Pledges the property as collateral. And that's the one that gets recorded, but not the promissory note. And then the various forms, agreements that are between the firm you work for and the clients you're working for, those are called agency agreements. We'll probably get into those tomorrow. That'll be something we start talking about in chapter 7 and 8. Agency is the relationship between a broker and a client. We got into a little bit of math. We finished up, I think, with how to convert square footage to acreage. And it essentially looks like this. We would take the dimensions of a lot, in this case 325 by 157, get the square footage of that red lot there, the red square, 51,025 square feet. But you've noticed this when you've done searches and just seen things out in the world. We don't talk in terms of square feet for land. We talk in terms of acres. So we need to know how to talk about this 51,000 square feet as acreage. So we just divide it. What do we divide it by? The four little old ladies driving 35 in a 60-mile-an-hour zone. So 51,025 divided by the 43,560 shows us the acres in that little red block. If we were to take this a little further, this would be another very real-world application. And we've done research and learned that land in the area sells for $14,500 per acre. Just multiply it together, that with the acres. And now we know how much this particular lot is worth, $16,965. So just be able to go back and forth, be able to go from acres to square feet and square feet to acres. And then also turn it into how much the lot is worth by multiplying the acres by the price of a lot. Oh, you got to know them. You're going to have to remember them. And whether that's just common sense, just kind of figuring it out, or memorizing T formulas, that could be useful. Just flip to a clean page in the notebook you got notes in, and maybe have a whole page or two of just these T formulas. So for acres to square feet, it's going to be this one. And that would be one you jot down. And then if it was turning acres into a value of a lot, it's going to look like this. The number of acres stays in the same spot as it was when we were figuring it out from square footage. And then we just put in the dollars per acre. And little hints about how to use this T formula. Remember that there's some sort of a rate that's always on the bottom. And then the other thing on the bottom is going to be a bigger number than whatever's on the top. So that might help you make your own little T formula in the moment. Like you're trying to figure out, wait, what should I do with these things? Okay, wait, I think I need to maybe multiply. So I know the rate goes on the bottom. And in this case, dollars per acre. Anytime the word per is used, that's a rate, right? So the thing on top is divided by one of the things on the bottom to get the other thing on the bottom. Just kind of having a pretty firm grasp of that concept can kind of help you make your own T formula as you need to. Something else we've talked about is, where'd it go? They might tell you in the test question that a property is worth such and such dollars per front foot. If they talk about a front footage, what they're talking about is the first dimension listed. So if it's 325 by 157 by 58 by 27 and it's some weird shape, the first number is the one at the street. That's how much street frontage there is, and that's another word for front footage, the street frontage. So front foot versus square feet. How do we get square feet? We multiply the one by the other. They're not going to give you more than just a square or rectangle. They won't go complicated on you. Because in real life, we're not expected to know how to come up with a square footage of some crazy octagon or worse. We'd get a survey. We'd find out the acreage via the survey. So on the test, it's just going to be X times Y. In this case, 325 by 157 to get the square feet. And then of that, which is the front foot, just the 325. And that was 4. That was chapter 4. We let's see. Oh yeah, here we go. Okay, let's talk about syllabus section 5. That's called land use control. Let me share that with you. Land use controls. So remember back when we were looking at those weird words, fee simple absolute, fee simple defeasible, and we were talking about that the seller could tell you basically what you're allowed to do with the property. They could dictate those terms when they sold it to you. Well, even if it was not that, even if the seller was not telling you that you can't use it as a bar or you have to use it as a farm, even if that's not happening, that's called fee simple absolute, right? When you own it without any conditions, even if you own it fee simple absolute, you still could be told what you can do with it from other ways. And these are those ways. You could still be told what you're allowed to do with it because of land use controls. And the purpose of land use controls are to make sure that property values are maintained. Because who here would want to live in a house next door to the landfill? Like seeing and smelling distance, or with a perfect view of the back of the Walmart or the front of the Walmart for that matter, right? You want to be in residential. You want to be around other residential units. And then you want the Walmart to be over in its section next to the CVS and the gas station and the McDonald's. You want that to be over there and you to live over here. And then you want the asphalt plant to be way over across town in the industrial section, right? So that's the purpose of zoning. So zoning is one type of land use control. It's the government-related one. Zoning laws are enforced by the government. We're also going to talk about private land use controls, and those are not government-related. They're private, right? They are determined by the person who's selling the property. And we'll get into those when we get there in just a minute. So our objectives here, how are they created, both public and private? What are the terms associated with them? Who's the authority person or entity? What's the purpose of this? What's the procedure? And so the first one we're going to look at is the public land use control. That's the one enforced by the government. The government has what's called a police power to enforce zoning laws. Doesn't mean the cops are going to knock on your door. It means the government's going to send you a notice, a letter, and say, you're not using your property the way you're supposed to. So the government is the authority, the enforcer of these zoning laws. They have a right to enact and enforce related to how you're using your property, planning, city planning, and then also building codes. The government also says, here's the very minimum level at which you are supposed to build a structure so as to keep you from killing anybody, right? We want to make sure you put the right electrical in, the right size circuit breaker box, the right plumbing, the right structure. You can't just do it the cheapest way possible. You've got to do at least this minimum standard of building construction so the roof doesn't fall on anybody or so it doesn't start an electrical fire. Those are building codes. There are statewide building codes that North Carolina requires, but then there could also be local building codes, local city, local county, that are stricter. And you tell me in the chat, what if the city building code is stricter than the state building code? The state says you must build walls with the studs 16 inches or 24 inches on center, 24 inches apart. The city says, no, we want them 16 inches apart. We want even more studs, stronger. And you got it. Yeah, you take that lesson. You've already showed me that you know it. This applies to 4 or 5 different things in real estate in this class. It's always the case that the stricter law or rule wins, no matter whose it is. Don't think just because the federal says something that you follow the federal or the state. It's whoever has the stricter one. Good job. And so another thing zoning does is regulate land development. What can you do with property? I live on the property that I grew up on and bought it in 2001 from my parents. Still here, not impressive. It's 5 acres. It's a little old brick tri-level and it needs work, but I refuse to do the work because it's going to get knocked down to whoever buys it, by whoever buys it. I got an offer, by the way, just last week, so that's pretty cool. It's been like 3 years on the market, and finally 2 people in a row at the same time were interested, so we'll see. I could be closed on this thing by October, but they want to do an industrial use. That's good because that's what it's zoned for. That's what I was running into as a problem. I'm using it for residential, but nobody who buys it from me is allowed to use it for residential because somewhere along the line over the years, it switched in zoning from residential to industrial. Do I have a hand raised on purpose? That's fine if you do. Just making sure. Hey, sure thing. Mm-hmm. Yep. So this is in the book, Unit 6 or Chapter 6, but on the syllabus, it's Section 5. So let me see if I can make some better sense of it. The syllabus itself, okay, good, is what you should follow. That's the order we're going to go in. But unfortunately, this textbook doesn't follow the order of the syllabus. So just if you find yourself lost, go back to the syllabus and see we've done 1, basic concepts, property ownership, that's 2, taxation was 3, transfer of title was 4, and now we're on 5 in the syllabus, which just so happens. So I would say look at land use controls as the name of it, and then look in the table of contents in the book for the chapter talking about land use controls. That's ultimately how you can clear it up if you get confused. But what you'll find, the chapter in the book about land use controls is 6. So you're welcome. I'm glad you mentioned that because it is confusing. Environmental is syllabus 6, but it's 20. Chapter 20 in the textbook. There are other textbooks that some schools use that go perfectly in order, but I've used this one for like the last 5 years. It's a good book. I just wish they'd rearrange it because it's just a needless complication. Because the syllabus applies to every pre-class across the whole state. So why wouldn't somebody write the book to fit it in that order? I don't understand. Somebody got a little big for their britches, I think, but sorry about that. I wish that weren't the case. And I'm going to double check my little layout here. It's pretty close, but I think we're good. I think this is actually lined up. 3 is 3. 4 is actually 4 and 5. That's the start of the complication. And then syllabus 5 Roman numeral 5 is chapter 6 in the book. And then syllabus 6 is chapter 20 in the book. And then syllabus 7 is actually chapter 7 in the book. It kind of gets back to normal once we hit 7. And it stays normal until we get all the way through 10. But when we get to syllabus 11, now it goes crazy again. And I think it's crazy for the whole rest of the time, actually, until we get to 18. Yeah, so that's kind of just an unnecessary hassle that I'm sorry you have to deal with. But I think I do have them lined up. And this study guide is how you can keep that in check too. Okay. So we've got, yep. So the land development. My property. So we're zoned industrial. I think I-1, whatever that means. It might be I-1, I-2, and it depends on the city you're in. You just go to the website, look up the zoning codes, and see what you're allowed to do with an I-1 zoning in Cabarrus County or Mecklenburg or Union or wherever. They're going to be different. They're not always the same. I think on this parcel, I looked it up once, I could have an indoor shooting range. I could have a mini storage facility. I could have a warehouse. And I think the buyer of this is going to use it for a warehouse. So we'll see what happens. But that's all part of zoning. I was told the city of Concord wasn't even willing to change any industrially zoned property anytime soon. So within the first month of putting this on the market, I got an offer from a developer who wanted to make townhouses, build them and put them on here, but they couldn't do it. We couldn't get the zoning changed to residential. That's what type of zoning would have been required for that use. So that's how zoning matters. They can tell me what I can do with this thing, right? Land use control. What is your responsibility as a broker when you're out there helping people? As to zoning, you need to discover and disclose what the zoning is for a given property that you're hired to sell or that you're helping a buyer look for. You better not sell something to a buyer letting that buyer think they can do something with it when they really can't. It's on you to get to the bottom of the zoning, the proper zoning for a property. That is on you to discover and disclose before making an offer. The purpose of land use controls, again, protect values, to protect health and safety. Why be next to a noise or a noise nuisance or an odor nuisance or toxic dumps or asphalt plants, things with horrible smells. So let's keep all that separate from where people live and where schools are. Health, safety, and welfare. Cities and municipalities tend to have a master plan for the community. Here's what we're going to do in the long run, the long range planning. And you could probably find that. Concord, North Carolina has one that goes out 5 or 10 years. Here's what they plan to do. They've had this in place for 5 or 10 years. And just this year, they've started spending that money. They just overhauled the courthouse. They built a whole new section of it. They're rolling out $2 million of construction in downtown Concord and downtown Kannapolis too, as part of their long-range planning. Something else we as brokers are responsible for are subdivision regulations. If somebody wants you to help them find land to turn into a development, like 10 acres, 100 acres, you've got to know what's up with the subdivision regulations, and we'll learn a little bit about that in this chapter too. We talked about building codes, and then finally environmental. That's huge, especially around water. Environmental regulations have to do with EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, any underground storage tanks from oil furnaces, underground oil tanks. Those over time, they were used a lot in the 40s and 50s, oil heat, oil furnaces, if they're still around, they might have rusted through and let out that oil residue, which could get into the water and affect a lot of things. So we have to look for red flags. Does this property have a buried or underground storage tank? That's a big deal. If you're selling property near water, Lake Norman, Lake Wylie, Baden Lake, the ocean, especially the ocean where the freshwater rivers dump out into the ocean, that's sort of a very delicate ecosystem where fresh meets salt water. Special plants, special fish exist there. You have to be really careful not to do things that would damage those. When it comes to environmental regulations, the person responsible for the cleanup in a situation is whoever has the money. So if the current owner didn't do any of the pollution, it was the previous owner, but that previous owner is long gone, dead, broke, maybe has no money, and they find out there was some sort of unapproved dump, landfill, and it's leaking toxic material into the soil or something and threatening maybe the water supply, then the current owner who didn't even do it, didn't even know about it, maybe it's a couple 100-acre parcel and they've never been to that corner of the parcel, and it's a bunch of old cars and oil barrels, they have to fix it. They would have to pay to fix it. That's how important these environmental regulations are. So as brokers, we got to stay on top of that too. It's those public land use zoning laws are enacted by the local government and enforced also by the local government. So that's the police power we're talking about. The government can send you a letter and fine you ultimately if you don't comply with what you're allowed to do with it. So besides uses of the land, zoning could also dictate how big the lot sizes are allowed to be. So say you want to buy 100 acres and put houses on it. How many houses are you going to choose to put on 100 acres? You tell me. How many houses would you want to put on 100 acres? As many as you can if you're trying to make the most money as a developer, right? The problem is, what is that 100 acres zoned for? And if it's not zoned for the number you want to put in there, can you change the zoning? Maybe you can. If you can make a good enough case to appear before the zoning board and say it's currently zoned R1, which probably means one house per acre, which would mean 100, not even 100 on 100 acres. Because you would, if you're making a development, you'd have to allow a certain percentage for roads, maybe trees and screening and things like that. Depends on the city's required plan. In Concord, they require a commercial use to include spending money to put in sidewalks and probably a certain amount of foliage and screening of natural area, just so that we don't look like a big weird industrial area with nothing but streets. So you got to factor in that into the budget and into the amount of land you're able to build on and build houses on. So 100 acres probably isn't going to hold 100 houses depending on the zoning. R1 would allow 100 houses, but probably less because you'd still have to have room for streets, maybe other features. R2, 2 houses per acre, in other words, about a half an acre apiece, that might allow 200 houses on there. When we get into townhouses, you might see R10. Now we're talking. Now it can be a nice densely packed zoned area that would allow more residences per lot. So whatever the zoning says. And if it's a city that already has a whole bunch of single family, they may not approve your project for more single family standalone houses. They might say, we want to get into some hybrid type properties, condos and townhomes, or vice versa. Maybe it's an area that has already a lot of condos and townhomes and they want single family. So now you're not going to be able to pack as many houses into your project as you would like because the city won't let you change the zoning perhaps. within any lot, you can't build to the far extreme, the property line. There's certain setback lines that are required. So let me see here. Those would look something like this. With where's a good one? There's several good ones here. So we've got these little, what's in the yellow? They've already highlighted it for me. You can't build the house over the setback line. So the structure itself must be within the yellow line, the dotted line. They've highlighted the dotted line. And on the side of the property, if you can see this sideways writing, it's a 3-foot setback on the side. You can't build any closer to the property line than 3 feet. And then on the back of the property, it's no closer to the back line than 20 feet. So if you're picking house plans, you got to make sure that house plan you're picking is a shape that will fit within this lot. Not just the lot, but the setback lines. Because the lot looks like it's, I guess that's 50 feet wide, according to this up here, but it's actually 50 minus 3 on one side and 3 on the other. It's actually 44 feet of house width that you're able to fit onto that lot side to side. The front setback comes all the way back here. Looks like, I think it might be 25 feet. So you got to adhere to this. This is all part of the zoning as well. That's to keep somebody from who might want the biggest yard possible from cramming the house way up to the front. So they have a huge backyard. And that would look ridiculous, right? It'd be a crazy looking neighborhood if some houses were right on the property line with no driveway and other houses were in the middle and some houses might be way at the back. So that's all sort of part of the zoning as well. Here we go. We come back from break. We'll pick it up, keep talking about zoning and finish that out and get on into private land use control. And I'll see you in 10 minutes. Okay, let's bring it on back. We got about 30 seconds. Welcome back. So we've talked about how zoning regulates lot sizes, also density. That's what I was talking about, R1, R10, how many units you can put per acre, setback lines, also building heights. Downtown, right? Uptown Charlotte, downtown, most towns will call it downtown. There might be restrictions on how tall you can build a building because otherwise it might ruin someone else's sight line. Especially if it's overlooking a park or a body of water, the ocean. You might have restrictions on what the lots in front of someone how high they can build. Natural resource protection, and then also zoning can affect the style and appearance of structures. You could have a zoned area, zoned residential, but then also I just lost my word. Another layer of zoning for historic, like a historic district. So if you sell one of those old houses, 100-year-old house in a downtown area, it's in a residentially zoned area, but it's also on top of that zoned for historic. And that's a big difference. You can't just do any old thing to a historic house when it needs repair. You've got to follow the guidelines required by the historic committee or the historic society or whoever's in charge of that historic district. If it's in a historic area recognized as such with that type of zoning and the front door falls apart, you can't just go to Lowe's and buy a $200 replacement door. You're going to have to get one made to replicate what doors in that era would have looked like. So, big difference for your buyer as a broker helping somebody buy, and the buyer thinks, well, shoot, let's just buy an old house in the historic district. Got to give them fair warning. Look, guys, that might come with some extra cost when it comes to maintenance and upkeep. And if this is a fixer-upper in a historic district, you can't just fix it up as cheap as possible, especially like a Victorian house, something where it's got a lot of scroll work, something that might look like this. There we go. I mean, look at this stuff. This is in the historic district. It cost a whole lot to replace those columns or those particular pickets. Might be that you can't even buy this picket without a special woodworker person turning it custom on a lathe. You just can't go find this in a typical woodworking shop maybe. And all of that's, what if all of that's just rotten because of over the years not being kept up, not being painted? Well, your buyer that you're helping buy this thing needs to know that the cost to rehab this property is going to be more than it would be a normal property, normal house in a regular little neighborhood. You get all kinds of issues when it's a historic house because you got to stay true to the period. Reproduction cost versus replacement cost is a big deal. Some other terms to know with regard to zoning is the area that might separate two differently zoned spots is called a buffer zone. It's what separates like the residential from the industrial. Let's have some buffer zones so that when you're on your front porch in your house, you can't just look over and see the back of the Walmart where the dumpsters are, or the landfill or the asphalt plant. Cluster zoning means using different densities within one project. Maybe within one particular development or project, you've got one area that's zoned for townhouses and another area that's zoned for single family. So one that's got an R10 zoning and another one that's got an R1 zoning. Let's see if I can find something about this here. This is a neighborhood in Charlotte, North Charlotte, called Highland Creek. And I think it ended up being about 4,000 houses. It crosses the line between Mecklenburg and Cabarrus County right there. So a little bit of it is in Cabarrus. And you've got all kinds of stuff. It's not clear as I'd like it to be, but there's a section in here, if you might could tell, this little area right dead center is like townhouses. So you can kind of see that they're clustered together closer. These houses just to the right are definitely single family, not townhouses, but the lots aren't all that huge. But if you look over to the far left over here, now in the middle, now those lots are bigger. So cluster zoning, right? You can have different uses within one big project, sort of a multi-use kind of thing. Also in this neighborhood are about 5 different swim and tennis areas. There's a retirement center. There's a school. So definitely a planned unit development with lots of mixed use going on in there. And the zoning needs to allow for that. They probably had to get some things rezoned to allow for that because when they ultimately bought it, it was probably zoned as agricultural farmland. So putting multifamily, which means townhouses and condos, duplexes, triplexes, things like that, with single family, all within the same PUD means planned unit development. Anytime you see one of these yellow signs, you can find a phone number and a website to get more information of what that sign is there for. It's there because that part of that road, the property right there in the vicinity, is about to be put up for potential rezoning. It's going to be mentioned in a zoning board meeting coming up real soon, and you could actually attend. That's open to the public and go listen in, or if you're the property owner, you could go and plead your case as to why the zoning should or shouldn't happen. So that information is in that yellow sign. Another thing you need to know for this class that applies to zoning is how the local city, government, or municipality, that would be just the overall word for any of those things, could still dictate what you're allowed to do with the property because of zoning laws. And it's called extraterritorial jurisdiction. In other words, even though property is outside the city limits by maybe a mile or 2 or 3, the municipality still has authority to say what can happen in that property. Extraterritorial, beyond the territory it normally is in charge of. So extraterritorial jurisdiction says the municipality can have a say in what can be done. It can regulate the areas right near the city within a mile or 3 or so. So that's just a definitional understanding to be able to be ready for the test on that one. Zoning laws and ordinances are there for the good of the public. They're not to benefit any one person, not allowed to do that. They must be implemented and exercised in a reasonable manner so as not to harm any one person. Again, for the good of the public. It's got to be clearly spelled out, specific. And of course, you can't discriminate using zoning either. Can't harm a protected class of individuals because of zoning laws. And it must apply to all the property fairly and in a similar way. Sometimes it doesn't. And when that happens, it could be for a good reason. We'll learn about that in just a moment. But that word would be called a variance. You could get a variance from the zoning law if you can prove that it's requiring you to undergo an undue hardship. That's not fair. And so you would have permission to be a little different, use yours a little differently from those around you, if you can prove that it is an unfair disadvantage to you. Something called a legal non-conforming use is what I'm doing with my property, right? Over the years, when I bought it in '01, it was residential. I don't even remember which year. I don't think I noticed when it happened, but it changed from residential to industrial. But it's legal that I use it for residential, but it's a non-conforming use because I'm using it residentially while the school and the daycare down the road at one end and the automotive business at the other end, they're using it commercially. But I'm able to use it legally in a non-conforming use because I was here first, right? And I'm what's called grandfathered in. Me and my one remaining residential neighbor, we're both legal non-conforming users of our property. No longer conforms to the current zoning, but we're allowed to keep using it this way as a matter of right. But we are restricted. If a truck veered off the road and slammed into half my house and completely demolished it, I might not be allowed to rebuild. Or if I did, I would only be allowed to rebuild exactly the way it was before the damage. I wouldn't be allowed to say, oh man, half the house is destroyed. Let me just tear the whole thing down and build a nice new house here. They would never let me do that because that would keep the residential use ongoing. The goal of a legal non-conforming use situation is that eventually the house is just going to rot and fall down. You can keep it in repair, but eventually it's going to convert to the current zoning anyway. So I wouldn't be allowed to expand it, add to it. I certainly couldn't add on to my house. Probably if I were to ask the zoning board, they'd say, no, you're zoned industrial. We don't even want you to really be using it residentially. You certainly can't make it more than what it already is beyond just normal wear and tear. So that's what they mean by tight restrictions with illegal non-conforming use. The idea is eventually it's going to conform because you're going to be done using it this way, as I hope to be around October when this thing will hopefully close if it all goes well. We'll see. Here's the variance word. If the owner is suffering an undue hardship, let's say that, let me see if I can draw something out. Let's say that the government says, look, we need to put in here's your house. One second. Here's our house. And it's on a lot. And we learned about setback lines. So we know that this house can't be any closer to the property line than these setback lines. And it's good. But the city decides that it needs to put in some sort of a drain line to handle the stormwater runoff for the good of the public. And because of this weird drain line or something, they need to chop off like half of the front yard. And so they through eminent domain, take half of the front yard. Let me see here. What would make sense? Oh, I know what I mean to say. There's a zoning ordinance that says the house has to be at least this many feet from the road, like 20 feet from the road. Can't be any closer than 20 feet. Let's call it 50 feet from the road. But because the city comes along and through eminent domain chops my yard in half, now my house is closer than the required 50 feet from the road. Not my fault. I'm suffering an undue hardship if they try to punish me for this because it wasn't because of my preferences. Therefore, I could be given a variance, allowing me to be 20 feet from the road instead of the 50. That was sort of beyond my control. So some sort of a variance would be when the owner could prove that otherwise, if you don't give me this variance to use it slightly different than those around me, then I'm suffering unfairly compared to them. Another one is called a special use, and that's letting the property be used for a different use that doesn't comply at all. So kind of sort of a related situation there. But those could be allowed. You'd have to appear before the zoning board, a board of people who would vote on it and say, yeah, that seems reasonable. You're allowed to do this. Or no, this is just not going to work. We're not going to let you do this. Here's our idea of a historic district. It's the word I was trying to think of is overlay district. So you have a residential area, but it's also determined to be in a historic district. So the historic district is an overlay on top of the residential. And so in addition to using it residentially, you have to adhere to whatever those guidelines are within the historic district. Rebuilding with certain types of craftsmanship. You can't knock it down and build something new in its place. It's historic. It's protected. It's got to look a certain way, aesthetically zoned. That's what that means. Aesthetic zoning requires a certain look because maybe they're all this sort of Victorian or colonial style. And they have to adhere to whatever the historic preservation guidelines are for that town. You can look them up too. For any given town, just look up historic guidelines or requirements in whatever city. As a broker selling property in those types of areas, you're going to need to be familiar with those things. Spot zoning is illegal. This is a case where maybe somebody on the zoning board is related to a person, and that person tries to get them, influence them to let them have a different zoning while everyone around them has like residential. You'll let me have commercial so I can operate the dollar store, right? It benefits the owner of the property unfairly, inconsistent with the public good. We're not allowing this spot zoning to help the whole public. It's just helping this one owner, and therefore it's not allowed, and therefore it's illegal. So on the test, you see the term spot zoning, just think illegal. Illegally giving one owner an ability to use something differently than everyone around. What should a broker do when a client or customer has a question about zoning or what they can do with the property? What's your best response? If they ask, what can I do with this R17 zoning? What would be a good response to that? Who might you point them to? There you go. Yeah. Let's not answer it. Let's talk to the zoning department. Here's the number, or here's the website. Go to the City Hall website, contact the zoning department directly, ask them, let's find out from the source. You would not want to say, well, I see other people doing this with that, so you'd probably be fine here doing that too. Don't make any assumptions. Don't give any advice. We have a higher authority or a different authority to go to, and that's the zoning people themselves. Let's check with the zoning department. And regardless of the fact that it's the government, which you tend to think of, or I do, as slow and difficult to work with maybe, I've had really good luck talking to the zoning department. I've dropped in at like 4:30 and sat in front of the main guy and asked him about questions about my property before, called them up and reached somebody. If not immediately, they called me back. They really did by end of day. And that is the same case with like a building permit department. If you want to find out if the seller of a property you're showing claims that they had a building permit for that extra garage, you could call on the spot while you're showing it to your client. Your client's walking through the house. You could probably actually call on the spot and talk to somebody and say, hey, do you have any building permits that have been filed for this particular address? Doesn't have to be your house. You can just ask as a member of the public, and they'll say whether or not they have. I had an inspector do that one time. We were looking at a house for my buyer. The inspector was suspicious at some work that looked like it had been done not according to building code, and so he called. He had him on speed dial because that's his business. And he asked, and we got the answer that yes, it was indeed, there was a permit pulled for that work to be done. So yeah, point them to the zoning department or whoever's in charge of the related question. We mentioned something called a subdivision regulation back in the intro. And here's what this is. If someone that you as a broker, you're helping someone buy property and they want to divide it. When they choose to divide it, they have to adhere to certain guidelines and regulations about how to go about dividing property up. So you tell me in the chat, how many lots that a developer might chop a piece of land into would constitute a subdivision? What would it be? What would be called a subdivision? Dividing it into how many lots would make it consider it a subdivision, which therefore would have to comply with subdivision regulations? How many lots to be a subdivision? That's a good try, good guess, or good educated guess. Anybody else? Got 2 or more. I've got essentially the same thing from Catherine. I've got 5, 12, 8 to 10. We're all kind of thinking of what the subdivisions look like that we've seen and driven through. And the smallest ones we've probably been through were maybe 5 or 10. 3, you're getting closer. Marcus had it on the head. Marcus and Catherine, even just 2. Dividing it into 2 or more lots, at least 2 lots. Now it's got to conform to subdivision ordinances, subdivision regulations. So that's a very testable question they like to ask. Dividing land into at least 2 or more lots makes it a subdivision. Sounds weird. Have you ever seen a 2-house subdivision? It's not so much what it looks like or the fact that it's a subdivision, Happy Acres, just 2 houses. It's what makes it required to have to comply with the subdivision regulations, and it's dividing it into at least 2 or more. So it just means that there are some city and county laws in place that dictate what you can do to create that subdivision, how that goes about. And that means this: to create a subdivision, even just 2 lots, the developer has to provide a preliminary plan. They're going to locate the land. They're going to prepare and figure out how they're going to split it up and make out the roads and put in the utility lines, make it into an improved lot, a series of improved lots. Then the final planning stage involving the actual purchase of the land and financing it with probably something called a blanket mortgage we'll learn about, which means they get a mortgage for the entire project. And then as they sell off 1 lot at a time, that's one less thing within their mortgage, right? Because they've sold it off. We'll get into that with the finance chapter. And then the startup. With the startup, they're going to record the plan. They're going to start building, and they're going to start selling and then transferring the properties. But certain requirements exist to keep them in line with how they sell versus when they close. There's going to be something called a preliminary plat approval. They've had a plat map drawn of the whole neighborhood, or the first phase at least. And that preliminary plat approval is not final and recorded, right? That means that's why it's called preliminary. But when you do have just a preliminary plat approval as a developer, now you can start selling off the lots and start building houses on them. So you got to have that preliminary plat approval in order to create contracts with people who are going to want to buy it. But they can't close on the purchase until that preliminary plat becomes a final plat approval and recordation. Plat has to be recorded in order for you to close on that particular sale, meaning that plat for that property you're selling to that one person. So it would turn in from that thing that we saw at Highland Creek to see if I can find one. To something like this. So maybe this is the whole community subdivision, and this is the preliminary plat of the whole thing, and you get somebody willing to buy this corner lot right there in the middle, and you can get it under contract with them. You can sign a contract as a developer and say, yes, I'm going to sell you this, but you can't close on it until that particular lot has a final approval. So let's take a look here. There we go. Preliminary plat approval is required for creating a contract, but final plat approval and recordation is required before closing on those contracts. And if you don't do that properly, close on lots in an unapproved subdivision, it's a criminal act. That developer is guilty of a crime for closing on a lot that has not yet been approved. That's how important this stuff is. Another thing that goes hand in hand with subdivision regulations is what's going on with the streets. Are those streets maintained by the government, by the city, by the DOT, or are they still private? And most brand newly constructed neighborhoods are still private in the early phase. They probably have in the fine print of the contract on page 37 that they're currently private, but they plan to dedicate them to public use eventually. And so that's a big thing for you as a broker. You want to make sure you tell your buyer, look, here's what this means. Look, guys, right now, the DOT is not maintaining these roads. There are 3 things that are required for that to take place. The road must be built to the standards required by the Department of Transportation, DOT. The developer would need to petition the DOT and say, we want to dedicate these to you to maintain them, and we're not done because it's not official, not final until the DOT says, okay, yep, we agree, we'll do it. We'll take care of the roads, we'll repave in 10 years, 15 years, we'll fix potholes. So they have to accept the deal, right? They have to accept the petition to maintain as public roads. If these 3 things don't happen, this is still a privately maintained road. And if for some reason maybe they aren't built to DOT standards and the DOT refuses to accept it, and maybe they never get fixed and brought up to the proper standards and they stay private, that means everybody who lives on that road is going to have to be the one who pays for the repaving, pays for the upkeep, filling in of potholes, and that's not cheap. It's expensive to pour new asphalt. So, as a broker, what does that mean? Just tell your client, look, guys, apparently this is a privately maintained road right now. They're promising they're going to dedicate it to the public, but if for some reason it didn't get dedicated to the public, therefore the DOT maintains it, you might end up having to help pay for it with your neighbors to be repaved, to be repaired down the road. So just make sure you inform them so they can make a decision. It's usually the case that it's all going to work out, that they do know how to build it properly and the DOT does accept it as public, and it's all fine. But you want to be a broker who makes sure to tell them what could possibly happen so that it's not on you. They can't come back and say, you didn't even warn me about this, and now I've got to pay $20,000 for repaving along with 5 other neighbors, right? So just get that off your shoulders. North Carolina law requires a developer to disclose whether the roads in the development are publicly maintained or private. And so we as brokers have to prove, verify, and disclose what the deal is. We can look it up. There's a website, nc1map.gov, to find out the various streets, whether they're public or private. Some look really good, look like a publicly maintained road. They might even have a green street sign that was replicated. But you would ultimately need to look it up to be sure. And by the way, part of being a publicly maintained road means that it has to be accessible. So all these fancy neighborhoods that are gated communities, probably privately maintained roads. Probably not public because it's gated. Can't just get into them easily. So that's how we find out. One way that we could find out about the status of a particular road is this web address. Whose responsibility would it be to discover and disclose the public or private road status? It'd be on us as the broker to verify if that developer has gone through the entire process of making this a publicly maintained road or not. So we as a broker hold that responsibility. We talked about building codes already. It's the basic standard of construction for keeping things safe and habitable. In order to build a property from scratch, the city would send out an inspector along the way after every part of the building process. So you'd pour in the footings, build the foundation wall, and then tell the city, look, I need you to send your inspector out here to make sure it's built right. The footings are poured and the walls are right for the foundation before I keep going. This is the builder talking. City sends an inspector. The inspector checks down the list, says, yep, looks good, fine. Okay, you're good to keep going. Now the builder frames in the flooring. Now they frame in the walls. They get all the framing done. They have a framing inspection. The inspector from the city comes out, checks the box. Yep, okay, looks good. Doesn't look like it's going to fall down. Same for electrical. When the electrical's done, have the inspector back out. Probably the same person. The plumbing, have the inspector back out. So this system of routine inspections as you apply for these various phases with your building permit ultimately result in that builder getting something called a certificate of occupancy, the CO. That's the point at which we can now close on the property. So as a broker, you want to be a part of this process. It's best when you help with people with new construction that you go visit the property throughout the process. Take pictures so you can show them the progress along the way, and just make sure you stay on top of it with the builder and make sure that those city inspections came through fine. Sometimes they don't. The city inspector comes out and says, no, you didn't do this right. Try again. Reschedule with me when you get it fixed. You missed this and this and this. You need to fix these things. And so finally, you'll get that CO, certificate of occupancy. Once all those inspections are completed, now it's safe for somebody to live in. Now it can be closed. We can have a closing. Another thing you'll find in your material is this thing called an Interstate Land Sale Full Disclosure Act. Have you ever heard the term, if you believe that, I got some land in Florida to sell you, or like a bridge in California to sell you? The idea of land in Florida, and we're up here in North Carolina, and you agree to buy a lot in Florida, and you don't even go see it first. You just buy it. This really happened once upon a time. And when you do finally buy it and close on it, and then you do finally get down there to see it, you find out it's swampland. So this prevents that. This is interstate, meaning across states, not just inside this state. It's other state. It's a different state than this one. Land Sale Full Disclosure Act. If it's undeveloped land being offered for sale across state lines that's at least 25 lots or more, a property report must be given to purchasers. Full disclosure of the deal. What's going on with this land? And that purchaser has a certain amount of time to rescind, back out of the contract if they choose to. If a developer violates the provisions of this act, another situation where it's a criminal act, could be criminally prosecuted, and of course they could be civilly sued. You can always be civilly sued, but criminal and civil measures could be taken. You don't need to know any more detail than this for the test here. If you do want to know more about it, certainly it's Googleable, but this is the extent of what you need for passing this test. Some other public land use restrictions that the government has to do with include environmental. FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Association, flood zones, like is it a flood property? That's a big deal. Wetlands near water, bodies of water, because of the delicate ecosystem of the flora and fauna. And then highway access restrictions. Can you just put your driveway out onto I-85? No, there's certain requirements of access onto roads. So all of those things apply publicly. These are restrictions put in place that the government enforces with its police power. Here's another big one that's like a daily you could run into any given moment. If the property is not close enough to the city sewer lines to be connected to them, then it's going to have to have its own waste elimination method. And that's when we get into a septic tank situation. So a septic system is what we use when we can't connect to the city sewer system to dispose of our septic waste, both solid and liquid. And this is a septic tank. It's a big concrete box like this. It has like a cover, so that one on each side usually, and you can see down in it. And the wastewater is piped into this tank, and some of that stuff is solid, some's liquid, and of course the liquid is either going to sink or float. I'm trying to be delicate here because you just had dinner maybe. And then from this tank, there are what's called leach fields that go out from it. It looks kind of like this. You'll have your house here. Oops, great house. There's our house. And then you'd have maybe the septic tank over here, buried in the ground. And then from that septic tank, depending on the bedrooms of the house, whether 3 or 4 or 5 or however many, the soil engineer is going to decide how many corrugated pipes can come out from this septic tank. And this area is called the leach field. These corrugated pipes are those black ones you see with the holes in them, corrugated. So the water that comes into this septic tank, like here's our little septic tank here, and water comes into it. And when that water gets up to a certain point, here's where the leach field, where these pipes are joined to the tank, that water is going to come out into these pipes, and the soil needs to be able to absorb that water down into it. And that's how a septic system essentially works. Well, some soil is better than other for absorbability. So the question is about a septic tank, the question is, how well does the soil absorb this wastewater? You certainly don't want it to rise to the surface and just sit there like a puddle of just whatever that stuff is. And so it's not based on the number of bathrooms, and it's not based on the size in square feet of the house. It's based on the number of bedrooms as to what size and type of septic system should go in here and how many of those pipes need to be added for the leach field. The idea is that any one bedroom of a house is going to have 2 adults in it. And so a 3-bedroom house would need to support, a septic system would need to support 6 adults worth of wastewater, 2 per bedroom, 3 bedrooms. So when you're talking about a septic system or a septic tank, the question is, what does it perk for? A 3-bedroom house? Can it support 6 adults worth of wastewater? That's the idea. So it's not bathrooms, it's not square feet. Does it perk for a 5-bedroom house? I've sold a house before, and it was a ranch, 1-level home with a basement, really nice basement. And my friend from school long ago was the client, and he and his wife had bought this house, and they had this basement. In the basement, they had finished themselves, made a theater room and a kitchen, a secondary kitchen, a pool table, billiards room, and then 2 bedrooms for their boys. They had 3 teen boys. One of them had a room upstairs. The other 2 had the 2 rooms down in the basement. And so he wanted me to market the property as a 5-bedroom home because he had 3 bedrooms on the main level, and then he had built 2 more in the basement. But when he asked me that, he said, "This is a 5-bedroom. You can put that on, market it that way, right?" My question was, how is your wastewater handled? Are you connected to the city sewer? And he said, "Oh, no, it doesn't come out this far to this neighborhood. We have a septic tank." So my next question was, what size is the septic tank perked for? And when we looked up the septic permit, it perked for a 3-bedroom home, the original house, because originally the basement was not finished. And so I had to tell him, "I'm sorry, I can't call it a 5-bedroom home. I have to market it as a 3-bedroom home." But we can certainly talk about how nice the basement is, and it's got all these rooms. I just can't call those 2 rooms bedrooms because it doesn't perk for that. Only perks for 3. So that's what your limitation is as a broker when it comes to septic tanks. Make sure you don't just brag about it being a 6-bedroom home if you have confirmed that the septic permit reveals it's a 3-bedroom. Great question. Marcus says, could he have changed that? Couple things he could do. Number 1, maybe the city has actually brought the septic lines out to that neighborhood, but he hasn't tapped onto them. So for a not insignificant amount of money, he could choose to forget the septic tank and tap into the city system. And we're talking probably $6,000 to $8,000 to tap into the city system. But then if we did that, we could certainly call it a 5-bedroom home because it doesn't matter. We're not restricted to the septic tank capacity, right? So that's one way. Or he could pay extra and have the septic system that perks for 3 bedrooms have that leach field and maybe the tank itself increased, expanded into something that can support a 5-bedroom home. So both of those things are going to require some money. But yeah, those are about the only solutions. Otherwise, we got to call this thing a 3-bedroom. So as a broker, we have to explain that. And it's funny when you call the local health department, you say, could you send me the septic permit on the house at this address? And they're pretty good about it. You usually get it within 24 hours emailed to you. And it doesn't look that much different than the thing I just drew out. As terrible as that drawing was, it's about like that. It's a poorly copied piece of paper, and it just shows the house itself. And then it shows where the septic tank is in relation to the house. And it has this is hand drawn, probably off the back of a pickup truck of some guy who works for the health department. And that's it. That's the septic permit. It's got some writing on it that talks about the house. And then somewhere on there, it's going to say perks for a 4-bedroom home. And that's what you're looking for so that you'll know how you can market the property. Now, we've been spending all this time on these things called public land use controls. What the city and county can tell you can do with it, right? And it's the city that's going to fuss at you, send you a letter if you do the wrong thing with it. And they are the police power, the enforcing power of this thing, of what you can do with your property. But there are also land use restrictions that are not public, they're private. And that's what we're going to talk about next. So if somebody sells their property to a developer, or it could be the developer themselves who decides this, some seller or other is going to say, here's what you can do with this lot. Maybe it's the developer, and they split it up into 20 properties, and they say, in this little neighborhood, we're going to require that if you buy and build in here, you have to at least build 2,500 square feet. No houses less than 2,500 square feet. And they have to be all brick. Nothing else besides all brick. And you can't build a fence over 6 feet tall. And it can't be chain link. It's got to be vinyl or metal or look like this. And here are the color choices you can pick for your front door and your shutters. I mean, it could go on and on, guys. The document within which they spell out these restrictions is called the CC&Rs. You'll hear that being used. It's covenants, conditions, and restrictions, some version of that. They may also be called protective covenants, and they're established by the developer to make sure certain qualities of the neighborhood are maintained. Style of house. It might be that we want houses to look like those Charleston homes, and they can be painted in those sort of pastel colors. There's Burkdale in Huntersville, kind of looks like that. Afton Village in Concord looks like that and has those requirements. So it could be colors of things. It could be how the landscaping is done, that there has to be a certain minimum of trees planted. You can't just not have any. Even the storage sheds, you can't the restricted covenants might say you're not allowed to buy one from Lowe's and just truck it into the backyard. If you want a storage shed, it's going to have to be built to match the house. Tell me more about your question there, Joseph. Give me a little more to go on, if you don't mind. They could dictate fencing heights, fencing styles. And again, this is private. So if you violate this, if you paint your door purple and purple's not on the list, or if you build a 10-foot fence instead of the 6 maximum required, what's going to happen? Are you going to get a letter from the city? No, it's not a public land use control. It's a private one. How do you think those sorts of things are enforced? There you go. Perfect. The neighbors can sue you and say, oh, you're violating it. We're going to take you to court and sue you because you're not complying with the land use controls, the private land use controls. So it would be through the court system. Good question. What about an HOA? So an HOA means a homeowners association. Got a lot of leeway here. Oh yeah, okay, I got you, Joseph. Yeah, maybe they might, the developer might say, here is the list of builders that are allowed to build in this neighborhood. Certainly. That could be. Or they could say, we don't care as long as they build at least 2,000 feet all brick in this style, blah, blah, blah. Long as whoever builder it is complies with these very exact directives. Sure, good question. So we could have covenants and restrictions and no HOA at all. An HOA could also be one of two things. It could either be a body of the owners, like a board of owners, maybe like 10 people who live and own in the neighborhood, and maybe they run it for a while. Maybe they run and keep those rules. And if you don't bring it could even be that you have to put your garbage can out of sight until the garbage day of pickup. And if you forget to bring it back in and put it out of sight again, they're going to send you a letter. Or they might even say, if you decide to sell your house, you can't just let that agent use any old sign. They got to have a special sign made with our colors to match the neighborhood, to make it look pretty. I've sold a couple houses like that, and I had to have a sign made. And I did one, and I didn't even think that they would care about the sign. And I just threw a sign up because my clients wanted to hurry up and get it on the market. And sure enough, it was on me. I totally didn't even think about checking. And it was one of those neighborhoods that required a certain look. And within the day, somebody sent them a letter from the HOA, and they ended up finding them $50. Of course, I covered it. I paid them back for that. So some can get pretty militant about this stuff. So maybe that little body of homeowners, that little board, maybe they get tired of sending out real estate sign letters and handling this and that, like the garbage can letters and the warnings. Maybe they want to hire out a professional management company to do that. So the HOA could be that board of owners only, or it could be the management company like Henderson Management. Cedar is another one. And I could do it myself as a real estate firm. With my little firm, I could choose to go around to neighborhoods and say, hey, do you guys want me to manage your homeowners association? I'll be the management company for it. I would never do that to myself. I'd rather just chop off some fingers or something. That'd be more fun. But that could happen, right? So the HOA might be a management company, or it might still just be the little board of actual homeowners. But regardless of whether there is an HOA, there might not even be one. It looks like a normal neighborhood with brick houses or not brick houses or whatever, and it's well kept. Maybe those neighbors are all behaving themselves and mowing their grass within every week or whatever. But it still has a set of restrictive covenants, a set of covenants, conditions, and restrictions. It still has those, but it doesn't have an HOA to enforce them. Because again, the neighbors can sue you because you don't comply. So Some neighborhoods don't have an HOA, but they still have restrictions. We as brokers have a duty to discover and disclose if the house we're selling to our client is subject to private restrictions. Let's see. Go ahead. That last person that's listed iPhone with the comment, rename yourself so I know who you are, please, for the Zoom chat. But let's see. If I bought a home and had neighbors, I can't build onto my home without being sued. You would have to just follow the covenants, conditions, and restrictions as to what you can do with your home. And it's not necessarily the case that they would even enforce it, but they could. They could sue you over it, but it just depends on, you would have to, if you want to build like an extra room on your home, if that's what you're asking, you're going to need a couple of things. You're going to need to get a building permit from the city, for one thing, because they care that what you're building is going to be safe. And then you would need to check the covenants, conditions, and restrictions to see what any sort of limitations there might be. There may be none. It might just need to be out of sight from the street. It might need to just, if what you have now is brick, it would also need to be brick. Or maybe not. There's a neighborhood around the corner called Falcon Chase with no HOA. And you can kind of tell. A lot of the houses keep up well, but there are 3 or 4 houses when you drive down the main street that are never mowed, that there's like in the driveway, there's always a car up on blocks being worked on, or a blue tarp over top of the fence. It just looks bad. And that's sort of the extreme of why someone might want an HOA, is to keep that from happening. If you're the house across the street trying to get sold and the buyers are coming and looking at yours and looking across the street at that, might give you a hard time getting maximum price for your house or even getting it sold in a decent time frame. So yeah, check the CCNRs, see what you're allowed to do there. Right now we're allowed to have a break, so I'll see you in 10. When we come back, we'll finish this chapter and move on into the next. welcome back. We're back. Okay. So again, those private land use controls are enforced by your neighbors through the court of law. Public land use controls are enforced by whom? Who enforces those public ones? The government. They're going to send you a letter. Those covenants and restrictions, called protective covenants, are enforced by the HOA as well as the residents. The HOA could enforce them as well. They could fine you. What if you don't pay your HOA fees? You know, when you have an HOA, you have to pay HOA dues. What's the worst that could possibly happen if you don't pay your HOA dues? Here we go. You stop paying your HOA dues. They might start out with the fine, the late fees. Marcus got it. There's another case of involuntary alienation. They could foreclose on your house. You could lose your house for not paying your HOA dues. That's pretty big. That's pretty powerful, right? So just keep all that in mind. And as a broker, you know, we hear all kinds of stuff. We hear people who say, I'll never live in an HOA. And I get it. I get why they maybe wouldn't want to. Or they might say, I always want to live in an HOA because that keeps my neighbors from doing something that would harm my property value. Whatever their feelings probably come from some experience they had, or maybe from hearing of other people's experience. There's no right or wrong. It just depends on what they want. But what is your responsibility as a broker? Find out if there is an HOA. Find out if there are covenants and restrictions and get them for them so that they can read them. When should we get those covenants and restrictions for this buyer? We're a buyer agent. Our buyer is interested in a house in a neighborhood with covenants and restrictions. When do we need to make sure they have a chance to read through those covenants and restrictions? And these things might be 50 or 60 pages long. Certainly, definitely before closing, but I would say even sooner. What we'll learn in chapters 9 and 10 is we'll learn about a period of time during under contract called the due diligence period. The due diligence period is an amount of time that a buyer has to have any inspections or for any reason to decide they want to walk away from this contract. There are two amounts of money associated with buying a property. One of them is called a due diligence fee, and that is a non-refundable amount of money that's going to be made in the check directly to the seller and given to the seller as soon as it goes under contract. In exchange for that due diligence fee, you're buying for yourself an amount of time as a buyer to do any sort of research, inspections, and even just to have the ability to walk away. What you're walking away from is the contract, but you're not getting back that due diligence money. The second check you write when you buy a house is earnest money. That's not going to the seller. That's going to sit in a special account, probably held by one of the real estate firms or maybe by the closing attorney. And that's still your money, but it's out of your reach. You can't get to it. It's sitting in a trust account held by someone else. Both the earnest money and the due diligence money are going to count as credits to you when you do close down the road. But that due diligence period is the time the buyer can choose to back out of the sale for any reason or no reason. That's the time that you should definitely get these covenants and restrictions to them so they can review them and decide, oh, wait, wow, these restrictions are way too restrictive. I don't want to live here. Forget it. I'm out of here. Now, Catherine brings up a good point. Before showing the house, ideally for maximum protection, And also it would accomplish saving that buyer the due diligence money, because they're not getting that back if they decide to walk from the deal because the restrictions are too strict. So yeah, to protect them the very most, it would be get them to them before they even make an offer. But it may not be that realistic in terms of how fast you have to act in this current market, right? But definitely at least by the end of the due diligence period, so they can choose to walk. And the thing about the due diligence period is if you choose to walk away during it, you don't get your due diligence money back, but you do get your earnest money back. So again, that's probably the most realistic, ideal time to make sure you give that buyer the chance to read through the stuff so they can walk away if they need to, based on what they find in those covenants. So there it is. That's what the HOA can do. Foreclose on the house if you don't pay those dues for a long enough time. And so we as brokers, according to real estate license law, have the duty to discover and disclose restrictions, zoning laws, and private land use controls. Make sure we don't misrepresent. Make sure we don't give answers to questions before we're sure. They might say, hey, is a chain link fence okay here? And to say, well, I don't see one out here, but we're kind of in the country. I'm sure it's fine. Don't say anything like that. Never give answers. And embrace the fact that you don't know something. That's way better than being liable for having told them something wrong, negligent or willful misrepresentation, right, or omission. And I embrace it. I've been doing this 27 years in July, and I'm the first one to say, I don't know. Let me check on that and get back to you. Let's be sure. I'll be sure to give you the right answer, because I don't want that liability, right? And so we also need to recognize potential restrictions. If we're driving through a neighborhood and we see that there's maybe a certain type of style, or two of fencing, that's probably an indication that there is a covenant and restriction, a set of them, or a certain type of exterior siding of the house. We need to be able to recognize little hints or red flags that there might be some rules that these residents are having to abide by. So, to sum it all up, if there's a conflict between private and public land use restrictions, which one would you have to follow? The zoning says you have to have at least 3 properties per acre, but the private land use restriction says at least 2. If there's a dispute in rules, restrictions between entities, state and local, for instance, you got to follow the stricter one. Got to follow always the stricter one. All right, that is chapter 5, syllabus, section 5. Let's talk about some environmental issues. That's a quick one, but a big deal too. All of this is important for broker disclosure. And here's what we're talking about. What we're going to cover here is our responsibility as brokers, how to see some warning signs, and what are the remedies of some very specific environmental hazards, what are some federal and versus North Carolina environmental laws, and our liability issues as brokers. So, we don't have to be experts in environmental, but we do need to know a handful of things and look for red flags. We have a duty to disclose material facts and possible environmental hazards. And so essentially for these various 4, 5, or 6 very common occurrences, we need to know how are we exposed to the threat of these environmental problems, what's the risk to our health, and what's the remedy or what's the fix. Sometimes it's another word for remedy you might hear in the text or see as you're reading is remediation. How do you get it fixed? So whether it's lead-based paint or asbestos, in this case we're talking about lead-based paint, how do we fix it? We'll talk about that. Lead-based paint is a big deal because it was largely used in paint, right? Lead-based paint, all the way up to the 1978. At that point, they stopped using it. So, as brokers and sellers, we have to disclose if the property was built before 1978, period. You got to admit that. This property was built before 78, therefore might have lead-based paint on it somewhere. Odds are, if it's been marginally kept up over the years, there's about 45 layers of paint over the lead-based part. But the seller is required to disclose that, yes, it was built before 78, so it could be under there somewhere. That's essentially what it's saying. And there's two documents that they have to provide. You're going to be the resource that they're going to get them from so they can provide them to the buyer. So the seller gets it through you, but they have to provide it to the buyer. Who has to provide the lead-based paint disclosure? The seller. That's a testable question. Write that one down. Not the broker. Who has to disclose the possible presence of lead-based paint? The seller. How are they going to get the disclosure? Through you, because of your involvement. And it's two things. That disclosure says that we have given the pamphlet, Protect Your Family from Lead in Your Home. So you got to be ready to give that to the buyer. And it pretty much just spells out the dangers of lead-based paint. It can cause health problems, especially in the very young and the very old. The danger is breathing the dust. So if maybe a child were to gnaw on the windowsill, apparently that's a thing, or if it's an old window and as you open and close the window, it kicks up a little bit of dust from the paint. And if that gets breathed in over time, that could cause health problems. So this thing on the left is the disclosure itself. And in that disclosure, it says, does the seller know for sure that there's lead-based paint? They probably don't. Quite often they don't. They don't have to test. They're not required to do a lead-based paint test. But if they do know for some reason, then they do have to disclose it. But if they don't know, they don't have to figure it out. They just have to admit whatever it is they know. And then there's another section, this middle part of this disclosure that we get initials from the seller. The top part's for the seller. The middle is for the buyer to acknowledge, hey, I heard what you said. Or if you said that there is definitely lead-based paint and you provided maybe a test result, I got them. I received them, if that's the case. Or they might say, look, I understand that you're telling me you don't know for sure. And then that purchaser checks one of two boxes. I am going to test for lead-based paint sometime during the due diligence period. Or they might say, you know what, you've covered it a few times. I'm going to repaint it too. And so I'm not worried about it. So I'm going to waive my opportunity to test for lead-based paint. That's what the purchaser is picking between on this disclosure. And there's even a place for the agent to initial, acknowledging that they've told the seller what their obligations are. What are the seller's obligations? To just tell the buyer that there might be lead-based paint. And if they know for sure that there is, to tell them that and offer any supporting documents. Why might a seller know for sure that there's lead-based paint? They might have had it tested because maybe if they had work done, maybe this window had some water intrusion, and so the drywall under the window started rotting. And so that seller hired a contractor to fix it, cut that away. Well, before that contractor would start the work, they would need to actually ask the seller, is this house built before 78? And they find that out, then they would know this might have lead-based paint. So before I do the work and start cutting into drywall and making paint dust fly into the air where people could breathe it, that contractor has to be certified and has to take a sample and send it off to be tested to know for sure if it's lead-based. So that's how the seller could have found out maybe a year before they decided to sell it. They had that happen, and they got the test results back, and it was lead-based paint under there. Now they've got to tell the buyer that that's the case. So the seller's not required to do the test, but they do have to tell whatever it is that they do know. Both brokers and sellers have a responsibility to disclose it. And then this is the part about the contractor. According to the North Carolina Lead-Based Paint Hazard Management Program, any repairs that you have done by a third party must be handled by a certified vendor. But notice it says repairs for compensation. If you hire it out, then they're required to be certified to test for lead-based paint. If you do it yourself as a fixer-upper DIY person, because you watch HGTV, you don't need to be certified. You don't have to test it. You could just do the work. Probably should test it. That's what we mean by an exemption. Owner-occupied do-it-yourself repairs are exempted from requiring an EPA certified check. That's about it for lead-based paint. There is a disclosure. There's an extra disclosure required, that thing on the left, when it's a house built before 78. And that disclosure might only be it might only say, I don't know anything. Here you go. Here's what I know. Nothing. Checking the box. Initialing right here, signing it. So we would need to have that when we list a house built before 78, in addition to the other required disclosures that we'll learn about later. There might also be houses that have asbestos in them. And asbestos is similar in threat to lead-based paint. It can break apart into little tiny pieces and get breathed in. And while the lead-based paint can affect people's learning ability and cause other issues, health issues, asbestos gets stuck in your lungs and can become cancerous, can lead to cancer. It just so happens to have been banned in 78, but that's has nothing to do with the lead-based paint requirements. There is no asbestos disclosure. We don't have a certain piece of paper for it. We just need to acknowledge that asbestos is a big deal. And another key word to know related to asbestos is this word friable. That's the thing that means the asbestos can break into tiny filaments. It makes me think of insulation. You ever held and touched pink insulation and then your hands get itchy? It's because little pieces of fiberglass poke into your skin. So that's sort of what's happening in your lungs when you breathe in asbestos fibers, those friable fibers, those little filaments. They're particles that are inhaled, sticking in the walls of your lungs. They can possibly lead to cancer. And all kinds of products have been made from asbestos up until 1978. It's a great product for the intended purpose, which was to be fireproof and to insulate. It's just got that added downside of causing cancer, so too bad, right? We got to get rid of it. But if you've ever been in an old school building and seen flooring like that beigey looking stuff there in the middle photo, that's asbestos. They make some new flooring that looks like that, but it's obviously not asbestos. But the old stuff was made of asbestos. Also siding. There's a version of house siding that's made of asbestos, the thing on the left there. My favorite one is the lower right. There was literally fake snow that people bought to put beneath the Christmas tree and put the toys in for the kids, made of nothing but asbestos. That's kind of scary. It was also used for pipe insulation too. So the siding, you could get it tested. But what some people do for that siding is, as long as it's not broken and kicking up dust or people aren't inhaling it, it's okay. There's two possible remedies. Same remedies as for lead-based paint. With lead-based paint, you can either remove all that paint, which is way more complicated and ridiculous to do, or you could just paint over it. That's called encapsulation, covering it up. Same idea with asbestos. You could either remove it, have somebody remove it, wearing proper ventilation, Or you could cover it with maybe a vinyl siding so that the asbestos panels themselves don't break apart and fall off and get handled and breathed, the dust get breathed in. So either of those methods of remediation are okay. And it's common. I see asbestos shingled houses all the time. So encapsulation or removal. Another hazard that we deal with in our market is radon. And radon happens when rock material breaks apart in the ground. It can produce radioactive radium, which leads to radon gas, which comes up through the ground, and it might come up through your house basement, but not your neighbor's. So it's no rhyme or reason. It's going to come up through the house during times of rain more frequently because it can't get through the water-soaked ground. So the radon levels are probably going to read higher during a rainy time. Basements and slabs tend to have radon readings that read higher than like a crawl space, because a crawl space home, if you've ever been in a crawl space, there's actually some space for that radon, if there is radon, to come up and then blow out of the vents before it gets up into the living area of the house. So basements are, if it's a basement home that you're selling as a broker, probably good to suggest your client have a radon test. Inspectors will typically tell you that. What is it? It's a colorless, odorless, tasteless gas from the breaking down of rocky soil. It's the second leading cause of lung cancer. It's a big deal. There's a couple ways to test it. You could buy like a $50 test kit from Lowe's, and you would open it up, put it out as they direct in the right spot in your room, in your house, like the living area, kind of off the beaten path a little bit probably, and leave it out for 48 hours. And then you would bag it up and send it off to be read. A home inspector would offer this as an add-on, probably for another $150. And when they do it, it's going to be this $1,000 machine, and they set it up just like this, somewhere kind of off the beaten path in whatever area, maybe the basement, maybe even a couple areas, and they're going to leave it again for 48 hours. And it's going to take a sample of air every hour for 48 hours. And then they're going to take it back and plug it into their laptop. It's going to look at the average readings over those 48 samples. And what you're looking for is the number 4. It stands for 4 picocuries per liter of air. So 4 really tiny particles per liter of air. That's all you need to know. More than 4 picocuries is a material fact. If the radon level exceeds 4, we have a problem that we have to disclose to all the parties. And it would require mitigation, another word for remediation. It needs to be handled. It needs to get out of there. So a professional company would need to come in and set up a system that's going to get that radon out of that house. Here's what it looks like. Here's the lowest part of the house, probably the basement there on the left. And that big PVC pipe, they've drilled a hole in the slab foundation. They've dug out some soil in there and probably put some rock in. And then they've put this big white PVC pipe down in that hole. And this pipe has a fan that he's pointing to that causes suction. And it's sucking air up from that hole that they've made. And it's essentially pulling the radon in the house to that pipe, pulling it up through the pipe. And then in the middle photo, you can see, in that case, the fan is on the outside of the house. I think in North Carolina, they're always on the outside of the house. This guy's Mike. If you remember Mike from an HGTV show, he builds property in Canada. They build them really well. If he were local, I would use him to build a house because he's amazing. But so the left one is something based in Canada. But this piece here on the exterior is the fan that's causing the suction, that's pumping the radon up. And then if you'll notice in the middle, the very top, it has to send it out above the roof line. it can't go below the window and risk going right back into the house. So it's got to be this pipe that goes up. And sometimes, in order for it not to look so like industrial, they will cover it with what looks like a gutter, like a downspout to the gutter, just to kind of disguise it. But this fan just keeps running forever and ever, all the time. And you would have something in place to make sure it's if it stops running for some reason, it lets you know. There's a certain gauge on the pipe inside that kind of like a barometer that shows if it's a J shape, it's still working with suction. If it's a U shape, the suction has stopped. And I've sold a house before that had radon. It was a 2,500 foot ranch with a 2,500 foot basement. And to pay for the radon system to be put in, the buyer and seller actually split it between them. Buyer was nice. He said, I'll cover half if he'll cover half. And the total was, I think, $1,800. So it's like $2,000 or $3,000 or $4,000, depending on the size and how hard it is to put in the pipe. Might be difficult to access some of this stuff. And that's the solution. Just this constant sucking of the radon gas and pushing it out above the roof line. Interesting. Did that sound like pretty much what you experienced, Catherine, when you had it at your house? Where'd you go? Yeah, how much was did you have to pay for it? Yeah. Oh, nice. Yeah. It's not impossible. It's easily fixed. Yeah. Right. Did you have kids at the time? Yeah. Did you want to finish the basement or was it already finished? Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah. That's essentially what a basement is. But in this case, that's even worse because that's your main living area. So, yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah, you never know. It could be in yours, but not the one next door. It tends to be more prevalent in the mountain areas, but it certainly pops up in these middle parts of the states, And the question as a broker, if they ask you, because they maybe Catherine's friend is referred to you and you're a broker, maybe it's you're at the beach and Catherine's in Raleigh, and so her friend goes to the beach, and so she refers them to you, and they ask you, well, Catherine had this problem with radon. Should I get the test? Your answer is always yes, right? Anytime they ask for an inspection, yes, you should do that. If they refuse to have a radon or any other kind of inspection that you recommend, you should get that in writing. I suggested it, you denied it, you waived it, and that's good. Put it in your file. So next year, when they realize that they were wrong and you were right, they can't come after you and say, why didn't you tell me? You have proof that you told them. So that's just good advice for surveys, appraisals, and any of the many inspections you can have and suggest to them to have. But yeah, it's pretty easily fixable. But I sold a house last year that was about 5,000 square feet, and it had a radon, and it was going to need like at least 2 systems because of how sprawling out it was. So you just need to find out what's the case with that particular one. So this is formaldehyde, something found in foam insulation or pressed wood products. Gas gets trapped as it hardens, could cause respiratory problems. It was banned in 1982, and the ban was removed the next year. So now it's basically just a warning. We don't have any specific paperwork required. So far, with radon, with asbestos, and with this stuff, and with lead-based paint, out of all the 4 of those, lead-based is the only one that requires a specific disclosure. This is not one either. And that's about it for urea formaldehyde. I would anticipate a test question to be about asbestos or lead-based paint or maybe radon before probably this thing. Mold is certainly possible, though. Mold is scary. boy, it can just be no big deal, or it could be a life-threatening event. These are some terribly worst case scenario looking situations, but it's a fungus. There's bunches and bunches of different species of mold. You might be allergic to one, but not any of the others. With a certain level of moisture content in the air, it multiplies rapidly, right? So it can start growing pretty fast. I think I might have mentioned my realtor friend who went out of town and her toilet supply line burst. And so the ceiling of the kitchen fell down to the floor. And that was bad enough. But the other bad part was by the time she got home and started getting somebody to come in and make the repairs and dry it out, mold had already started. And so that's a whole other thing, fixing the wet damage, but then also fixing the mold. It's remediated by a moldicide. They remove the mold with like a very finely filtered vacuum called a HEPA vacuum. And then they spray the rest of it with a killer, like a mold fungicide type killer. It can start to grow when there's 60% humidity. That's moisture in the air. When the moisture content of the wood reaches 16%, mold can start growing, and then takes even less for it to maintain its growth. To measure the moisture content of the wood, you can actually buy it. Home inspectors have them, but you could buy a moisture reader from Lowe's. It's got little prongs in it. Some of them do, some of them don't. And you hold it to the wood, and it'll tell you how wet the wood is, how much moisture is in the wood. So all kinds of places where moisture can come in are subject to potential mold problems. And here's some ways to protect your crawl space. The one on the left is a really nice, typical house crawl space almost. You don't usually see the plastic going up the sidewalls or the piers, but you might see this vapor barrier along the ground. The one on the right is really fancy. That's totally encapsulated crawl space. Even the underside of the floor has plastic on it. The one on the left doesn't have that part. Excuse me. But it costs some money to fully encapsulate. When they do the one on the right, that includes conditioning the air of that space. So it's hooked into the ductwork, and it's just like foolproof. There's no moisture getting in that at all, but it might be several $1,000s to do it. So more likely you're going to see the one on the left. And even this one is more above and beyond than many. But that's some way to control the mold, because this plastic is on top of the soil in the crawl space. And that soil, just like any dirt, has a level of moisture that can evaporate and rise up through the air and get into that wood subfloor under there. And depending on if maybe there's a leak from a plumbing problem, or maybe a leak from drainage when it rains a lot, the water is diverted into the house, into the crawl space, so it's kind of pooling and puddling. All of that can add to higher moisture content, which can add to the likelihood of more mold. So here's the thing you need to know about mold. Is it a material fact? Is the presence of any mold a material fact? No. Write that in your notes. Is the presence of mold a material fact? No. But the presence of mold in an unusual amount, unusual location, is a material fact. Well, how much? It's essentially, if it's more than a square foot of mold, now it's a material fact. So that's a testable question. Is mold a material fact? No. Is a certain amount of mold a material fact? Yes. So just watch out for that difference. Here's another tricky part with mold, especially when it's a flooding situation. You notice that ceiling fan has the lid of a Tupperware container on it. So this was like a bad flood. The flood damage might be covered by your insurance, but the subsequent mold remediation probably is not. And that's what gets folks in flood areas. The flood's bad enough. It wipes out their house. But on top of that, the mold starts by the time anybody can address the flood damage. So call your insurance agent before a flood to find out what kind of mold coverage, if any, right? Do I need to pay extra? If it's an area more susceptible to flooding, maybe we need to see about adding on some extra coverage to handle that. To remediate for mold, even the smallest amount, I tend to hear quotes in the $4,000, $5,000, $6,000+ range, because they have to wear the hazmat suit. They have to bring the fancy vacuum, the HEPA vacuum, crawl into areas that are hard to get to, and then spray the fungicide. So it's an involved process, and it's not cheap. I knew of a pastor who lived in the parsonage, the housing provided by the church, and also, of course, worked out of the church office. And come to find out, both of those structures had heavy mold in the walls. So he was starting to feel sick and tired all the time. And then they finally realized there was a leak in the roof. They opened up some walls. They saw the mold. They had it tested. He went and got tested, and he turned out to be just very allergic to that particular mold. So much so that it got into his blood to the point where he had to have routine and repeated blood transfusions to take out the moldy blood that had been affected by those spores. He almost killed him. It took him like a whole year to get over this thing. It was just this long, drawn out, scary process. So it could be really dangerous, or it could not even bother you at all. It could just be like, oh, that kind of smells like a musty basement. No big deal. So it just depends on your level of how allergic, if at all, that you might be. So as brokers, we need to be watching out for red flags, right? If we find out our property or listing got flooded or has moisture problems, or the crawl space seems extra wet, we open the crawl space door and look in there and it's got puddles of water. Look up at the underside of the floor and see if the insulation is hanging. Maybe that's so wet that it's starting to become like stalactites, hanging down. Might be some sign that there's some mold issues. So that's a material fact. If there is a certain amount of mold, but not just any amount of mold. The fact that there's mold is not, but a certain amount, at least a square foot or more, yes. That brings us to this kind of an idea. We talked about it a little bit, the underground storage tank. Particularly houses maybe built in the 30s, 40s, 50s that had an oil furnace, and that furnace, they stored the oil in these tanks, so you don't want to look at an ugly tank above the ground, so they'd bury it. But the problem is, over time, it might rust through and the oil could escape into the soil. And then maybe even worst case, get into the well water. So we have to disclose as a material fact the possible presence of an underground storage tank. What are some red flags? The age of the house. We might see, if you ever seen like in the hallway of a house, a grate in the floor, like a square big grate that all the toys fall into. That might have been a sign that it used to have an oil furnace. And so it might not have an oil furnace anymore, but maybe when they took the furnace out, they just left the underground storage tank in place. It's considered a UST or underground storage tank, even if only 10% of it is underground. So it's got to comply with certain cleanup requirements because it's an underground storage tank. They mention here in this graphic some clues that a tank might be outside. So you could see this pipe poking up from the ground. That would be what you use to put more oil back in it. And another pipe could be right beside it, or in this case, it could be mounted to the house. And that's the vent pipe so that it can have a way to draw out. Sort of like when you pour water out of a closed pitcher. You don't just turn it completely upside down because it's going to do that glug glug thing, right? You do it kind of gradually so air can circulate and kind of let it pour smoothly. That's why this vent pipe is here. So you might see some things like this. These two pipes side by side in the flower bed next to the house. You might not see them, but still be suspicious. And it could be that the owner got a little sneaky, dug down about 6 inches and chopped them off and buried them. there are a couple ways to remediate USTs. Obviously, the best way would be to pull it up out of the ground. But I heard of one recently that was just too close to some certain lines in the house, and it was to pull it out of the ground would have compromised the structure, and so they left it. So the other thing you could do with a tank, if you can't get it out of the ground, is fill it up with what they call a medium, like a sand type of a medium that gives it structure and keeps it from collapsing, from rusting through. Another thing related to environmental protections is this thing called CERCLA. It's called the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act. Essentially, this thing says that whoever they can find to pay for the environmental cleanup is going to be the one that has to pay for it. It might be the current owner, even though the current owner didn't do it. It could have been the previous owner or two owners ago who caused this environmental damage or pollution. But because they're gone, dead, broke, have no money, can't be found, whoever they can find, the current owner pays for it, pays for the cleanup. Created in 1980 through the EPA, strict liability means the current owner is ultimately responsible for the cleanup if you can't find the one who actually did the damage. Other environmental laws apply, and a lot of them have to do with water areas. So Coastal Area Management Act, got to have permits to do any sort of development or change along the coast. Again, because of the delicate ecosystem, right? The Dredge and Fill Act requires a permit if you're going to fill or dredge. What does that mean? I knew this rich old dude one time, family friend, and he lived on Lake Norman. And I was looking at his house, and we were walking through the backyard, and he said, yeah, my boat's too big for my dock. I need more depth of the water at the end of the dock. So I'm just going to get the backhoe out here and just dredge it up. That's what dredging is, to dig up the soil at the bottom of the water, at the bottom of the lake, to make it deeper. He said, I might get fined, but I'd rather have what I want and get fined than to apply for the permit and they deny it. And I'm just sitting there. It wasn't something I'm trying to list, so it really wasn't my problem. But I'm like, okay, well, good luck with that. We'll see what happens. So he was asking forgiveness rather than permission. If I were entering into a real estate transaction with him, that would be terrifying, right? I'd have to let him know, look, I have to disclose, what's going on here. So thank goodness that wasn't happening. But that's the Dredge and Fill Act. You can't just dump more soil into the lake or take some out without getting a permit to do so. Erosion control, sedimentation plans, buffer zones being put in place all fall under the Sediment Pollution Control Act. These are just various environmental laws. I doubt you'd see much in the line of test questions related to these except for what are some environmental laws. Pick which of the following. And if they had three of these, and then they also had the Truth in Lending Act, which we'll get to when we get to finance, then the Truth in Lending Act is the exception. That's not an environmental related legislation. I think it'd probably be more like that you could see a test question. And then related to the UST, Underground Storage Tank, there's a Leaking Petroleum UST Cleanup Act. No unauthorized discharge and cleanup allowed. You've got to get a permit to clean that up and to dig that up and replace it, or not replace it, but to remove it. So for these environmental issues, our broker responsibility is to figure out what it is, recognize red flags, see if you can discover it, know for the test, know why is it dangerous, and what are the various methods to fix it. For lead-based paint and asbestos, the fix is either encapsulation or removal, right? Remove it completely or cover it up. For underground storage tank, the fix is to either fill it with a medium or to remove it. For radon, the fix would be to put in the mitigation system, which is that perpetually running fan to pull it up out from the house and push it up above the roof. So just knowing those differences, knowing how you fix the various things. This is not in the textbook. It's just good to know. Carbon monoxide detectors are useful. Carbon monoxide is another colorless, odorless gas that can kill you. This is faster. This can just put you to sleep forever and ever overnight if there's a leak of carbon monoxide. Radon is built up over time, cause cancer. Carbon monoxide is sort of like your car exhaust almost. It comes from anytime there's gas appliances in the house and there's some sort of a malfunction with those units. Like if it's a gas furnace and something in that furnace called the heat exchanger has a crack in it because it's an older furnace maybe, that heat exchanger that's cracked could emit carbon monoxide. Or the gas logs might have a problem. So anytime there's a gas appliance in a house, as the broker selling that house, give somebody a carbon monoxide detector or a card to Lowe's so they can buy one as a closing gift. Make sure there is one. There should be one. But those are important. Anytime there's a gas appliance, and most counties require them. You might see these lovely high tension power lines. There's no disclosure required. It's a controversial topic. Some people are worried about them, some aren't. Some are worried about the EMF, electromagnetic field. Not in the syllabus, not in the textbook, but out there in the wild when you're a broker. Just know that some people are going to care, maybe people with kids. If it's too close and you're right under them, you might be worried about some kind of electromagnetic field repercussions. So do have your client do their own research. Don't offer any opinion. Say, hey, clearly this is a thing. Here it is. That thing exists here. Do your research to see if that's something you're comfortable with or not. I bet those houses will sell for cheaper than if those power lines weren't there, right? So that might be the trade-off that they don't care about. And then finally, a landfill. Good old landfill. I've been talking about that for this whole time together. And this is how they do it. They bury the stuff very strategically, very scientifically, and they put in these vent pipes. If they didn't have these ventilation pipes, methane and other gas could build up and cause explosions or fires. Things could actually heat up and catch on fire. So the pit is lined with clay to keep it from leaking into the ground and to get to the groundwater. It's got some topsoil on top. They cover it with plastic, and it's just this process. It's a very sophisticated process. So the gas buildup has to be vented. Eventually, this landfill gets full. There's no more room to put anything else. And so what can you do with a filled up landfill? It would be something like, certainly not a neighborhood. Good one, Marcus. Perfect. Exactly right. A park, a golf course, something like that. Yeah. And you had a question. What about the spaces of the house you can't see? For what? For which thing? Oh, mold. Yeah, that's the tricky part. Because obviously, as part of the home inspection, you're not expected to pull sheetrock down off the wall. If there's a leak, they would test for mold wherever they could access, and then they probably would, if it was a bad enough leak, pull off some sheetrock and see if they saw any, or they could just punch little 6-inch holes, look inside and see if they saw any sign of mold. So yeah, that would lead to more investigation for sure. Okay, guys, that's about all we need to spend on environmental. And it's also break time. So I'll see you back here in 10. Welcome back. We are perfectly on schedule for week 3, where we've gotten to this point. Agency. So we're going to dig into the first big chapter. It's the first chapter that comes with a lot of questions on the test. Agency is something important through your entire career. It represents that relationship you have with your client, right? And the protections you're required to provide your client. We're going to learn about words like fiduciary duty, things like keeping your client's confidentiality, being obedient to their wishes, being loyal to them, and more. So we'll get into that. So we're going to talk about the laws and practices first. That's in Unit 7 in your book. And then Unit 8, and also the syllabus, happens to be the same number for these particular ones, is more specifically the forms, contracts that we use, the agency agreements, the things that actually hire us. Because what is it that requires us to have a real estate license? You remember that part? Why do you need a license if you're doing what for whom? Yeah, essentially getting paid to do real estate for somebody else. If you're doing real estate for yourself, you don't need a license. You might only plan to do real estate for yourself, but you're here to get a license because you want to end up getting access to the MLS. I get that. But that's officially why you need the license. Doing real estate activities for someone else, not yourself, for some sort of compensation. And so this agency is the way we do it. This is what might frustrate some people when they really grasp how much fiduciary duty we have on behalf of our client, to the point where we have to put their needs even above our own. It could be that you don't even get paid, or you take a hit because you got to put your client's needs above your own. Hopefully not. And it really sits in your lap as to how well you provide proper disclosures so as to not end up having to pay for your mistake with your commission. But we'll talk about all that. What we're going to go into is this concept of implied agency. That's a level 1, a recall, level 1, know the definition. We're going to cover what's the Unfair and or Deceptive Trade Practices Act, as well as the Lead-Based Paint Act. We saw what lead-based paint was an hour ago, but now we're going to see how that applies to the paperwork and our requirement to disclose. We'll see some level 2 content, which is basic agency terminology. What is our fiduciary role? There's an acronym that goes with it. And the various classifications of relationships of agency. And what is the scope of our authority? What can we do on behalf of someone else? Can we just help them negotiate a contract, or can we sign their name to the contract? Or can we make every decision for them like an attorney would? So we'll see what those things look like too. People come to us in this business for lots of different reasons. What is real estate activity that we're doing for another for compensation? It could be auctioning. We could be selling their house by auctioning it off. We're the auctioneer. But don't forget, if you do choose to use auctioning as a way to get someone's house sold, it's going to require an auctioneer's license along with the broker's license. And you got it, Marcus. Property management is a big one. I just ran into an agent on Facebook the other day, and I think she's about to retire because she reached out to me and said, if you know anybody who's in property management, I've got a little small portfolio of clients that I would like to divest to them. So she's going to want to turn over her clients to this other broker, whoever we might run into, and that broker would probably pay her a piece of the income to a certain point, maybe for a couple of years. Basically, she's going to sell her property management business. That has its own separate and an additional layer of agency responsibility. As a property manager, you do have authority to sign on behalf of your client, but you don't when it comes to helping somebody sell something, buy or sell something. So we'll see the difference there. Negotiating contracts, negotiating repairs, listing properties for sale, helping buyers find properties. It's all a part of this. This is why people use us. Every year, there's always some new thing that comes along and people are like, oh, this is the beginning of the end for real estate brokers. You're not going to be needed anymore because now we have iBuyers or, companies that are buying property directly. They list the property, but they will go ahead and give an offer and buy it from them too, or some sort of a robot or an algorithm or some easy Zillow's estimate or some more technological development. And the threat is always, oh no more agents eventually. Well, I dare you. I've seen it. And these improvements come along. iBuyers came along. That's when a company will make an offer on your house, not just offer to list it, but offer to buy it. But if you're not watching the headlines, Zillow went out of business from their iBuyer program. They gave it up. They're going to partner with Opendoor, another one. So some of those iBuyers lost their butts. They made way too high of an offer to get those listings and they weren't able to sell them and get their money back. So who knows? I think at the end of the day, there's always going to be a significant portion of the market who wants a human to help them with their real estate. There's going to be people that figure out how to do it by themselves too, and that's fine. Good for you. I want to have that option myself, so I don't begrudge that of someone else. I don't think everybody who touches real estate should come to me to do it. There's plenty for everybody. Even though we have 84,000 active licensees, doesn't mean all of them are selling houses all the time, because they're not. So anyway, they come to us for lots of reasons, and that's going to keep on developing, evolving, coming and going, ebbing and flowing. It's just going to depend on the market. We don't care. Just respond to the market, figure out something to offer, and offer it and do your best. And the market will reward you. You just got to find your niche. But it wasn't always like it is now. And if it were still the way it was in the beginning, there's no way in the world I'd be in this business. Because when I came into this business, I looked around in the office that first day in 1996, and I saw these books that were about this thick. Can you see my little picture there? And they weren't textbooks. That was the MLS book. It was the tail end it was right when the MLS was a computer-based database. But there were still some dinosaurs in the business that were subscribing and receiving this big old catalog of the same information. Can you imagine doing this business out of this book? You want to find 10 properties for your buyer to consider buying, and you had to flip through a catalog of properties and make copies on a copy machine to give them to them. And then once they decided to make an offer, you'd flip to the back of the book where they put the sold properties to come up with how much you think the offer should be for. Working out of that freaking book. I can't even imagine. No, thank you. And eventually those books went away. But the database, the technology, the MLS as it is today, changed everything. And it's still evolving. We are no longer the gatekeepers to the properties that are available. For a long time, up until the mid-90s, if you wanted to know what was for sale, you had to talk to a real estate broker. But now clients come to me all the time and they tell me what they want to go see. They've already done their research. They found them already on homes.com, realtor.com, namearealestateagency.com, or Zillow or whatever. Now, to be fair, when they find them on their own through these websites, usually those websites are not great about updating the most recent status of the listing. If a listing sells and is no longer available, it's not active anymore, but it's just under contract now, so nobody's allowed to see it, some of those websites aren't great about updating that status and admitting that it's actually unavailable. They still show them as active. Why is that? because those websites are not designed to give you free information like you think they are. They're designed to make you interested in listings, to give them an email address, to sell that email address as a lead to brokers. That's why they exist. And that's why a couple of them are billion-dollar companies. It works. I don't buy leads like that, but many, many, many agents do. There's nothing wrong with that either, as long as it fits your plan. Some of these people are paying $3,000 a month for a certain number of leads. The thing is, how many agents are getting those leads at the same time and having to compete against 5 other agents for this same potential lead person? And that lead person is getting inundated with calls, and whoever happens to build the rapport the quickest, first in line, and also manages to get the trust, wins. That's one way to do it. I don't like that way. I don't choose to do it that way, but that's the beauty of this business. We can carve out the niches that we choose. We can do other ways to get business. But that's all today. How did it start? In the beginning, 1950s, all the way up till the 50s. The only way a broker ever represented a client was as a seller's agent. There was no such thing as a buyer's agent. There was no possible way a buyer could hire a real estate broker to represent their interest only. Didn't exist. And it wouldn't exist all the way into the 1990s. So in the 50s, there wasn't even an MLS. If you wanted to move it to a new town, you wanted to find out what was available for sale, you'd have to look up the real estate firm, real estate offices. Maybe there's 2 in a particular city. You'd go to the one, walk through the door. You'd say, hey, what do you have for sale? Okay, this, and this. Great. Don't like any of them. Thanks. And you'd leave and go to the next one across town. Hey, what do you have for sale? This, and this. Whatever they had listed was what they had to offer, and they couldn't sell anything else. That's all they could sell. There was no cooperation. The MLS is all about cooperation. The multiple listing service, when you subscribe to it, you agree to cooperate with other brokers from any other firm that subscribes to it. This was not a thing back then. So if a seller hired an agent to sell their house, that was the company that represented you. And they'd put a sign in the yard, and buyers would only find your house if that person, that broker, ran ads in the paper or whatever, and then maybe somebody drove by the house and saw the sign. And if the buyer wanted to see your house that you've listed with that broker, they would call the name on the sign, and that's the only broker that would be involved. So the agent always represented the seller. There was no buyer representation, period. Well, maybe, let's just say one day a buyer came in the door of Mr. Sebastian there on the right, went in the door of him and said, hey, I think that's JOS stands for Joseph. Hey, Joe, what do you have for sale? And Joe said, well, I've got these 10. What do you think about them? And the buyer said, nope, they're not going to work for me. Well, maybe Joseph was talking to his buddy who's got another firm across town, John. That's the one on the left, that little shack, John Eberhardt and Sons Realty. And he knows John because they go way back, but they just work at competing firms. And he saw John yesterday at the cafe, and John was talking about getting a new listing. And so Joseph remembers in that moment, wow, this guy doesn't like any of my listings, but that one John was telling me about yesterday sounds like it would be perfect for this buyer. Well, Joseph could call John and say, hey, John, I got this buyer and I don't have anything for him, but I think your new listing might work. How about, I got an idea. John might say, go ahead and send him over. I appreciate it. And Joseph's like, hang on a second, John. Let's do something that works for both of us. I got an idea. I'll send him your way, let him know about your listing, and send him to you if you pay me some of the commission, basically a referral fee. Eventually, in other words, agents started figuring out, let's refer business to each other. If I don't have a listing for this person, let me refer it to this other agent that does have a listing, and I'll at least get a little bit. A referral fee might be 20 to 30% of the full listing commission. Who knows? It's negotiable. 10, 15, whatever they agree to. Better than nothing. And so Joseph, who refers it over to John, he doesn't have to do any work. All he did was make an introduction. Hey, buyer, John across town, the other real estate firm in town, he's got a listing I think you might like. Here's his address. Go see him. Go see his office. And so that buyer goes across town. He likes it, buys it. John gets paid. John sends Joseph a check of a portion of that commission. There's a referral fee. And I'm sure agents started doing that. Still no MLS. Still no official promise to share commission. And so eventually, let's say this happens a handful of times, and then Joseph, same thing. Buyer comes in the door. Joseph talks to the buyer, has no listings. He thinks of John. He knows what John's listings are now because now he makes it a point to stay on top of his listings too. And so Joseph calls John and says, hey, John, I got another one for you. And John says, well, appreciate that, Joseph, but here's the deal. I'm really busy. I don't really have time to handle another guy, another client. But I tell you what, instead of paying you a referral fee only where you send him over to me and I do all the work with that buyer buying my seller's property, how about you go show it to the buyer? You keep him as a client and you take him with you and go to my seller's house and look at it. And if he wants to write an offer, you write the offer with him instead of me doing it. And instead of me paying you a smaller amount for a referral fee, I'll split it in half with you and pay you half of the total commission. How about that? Now we have cooperation. Now we have this idea, wow, okay, instead of just giving up most of the money, I can have a chance to make half of the money and not have to do any of the work. So John, the listing agent, doesn't have to do any of the work, but he's paying Joseph and splitting it. And it wouldn't have to be half. It could be any kind of a split. So that became a thing to the point where in the 60s, they decided to make it official. And they said, let's make this agency cooperation thing a system. And so that started this process of an MLS, this concept of a multiple listing service, meaning all the agents who want to pay money every month to have access to these listings that are published in a book, what's for sale, what did succeed in selling. Now it's called a sold property. Now we know what a buyer was willing to pay for it. That's important, valuable information. Now, if we know what a buyer's willing to pay for a 3-bedroom brick ranch, we know that the brick ranch we're about to list is probably going to get something similar to that money. So that's a valuable database to have access to. And then, of course, between the solds and the active listings, and then the ones that failed to sell, the expired listings, they were on the market, but then they expired and never sold. That's useful because an agent can call those expired listings and say, hey, I see that you tried and failed to sell. Maybe it wasn't you, but it was your agent. Maybe I should give it a try. How about you hire me and let me show you what I can do? So it's opened up all kinds of opportunity. But of course, in the beginning, it was done through these books, these catalogs. So it gave this sense of cooperation. Every agent had access and could stand to make money from every other agent's listings. If they brought a buyer for someone else, it didn't depend on your little handful of 5 listings. You could make money on 1,500 possible listings from all the different agents who have all these listings that they've posted in the MLS. And from the buyer perspective, that buyer had the privilege of working with one agent to show them everything available. And they didn't have to just go through a whole bunch of different listing agents and re-explain their situation and build rapport and worry about one looking sleazy and one being not. They could just find one agent that they like, and that could be their person. And that agent could access any listing and say, here's what's available. It's not my firm, but it's the one down the street. Do you like it? Oh, no? Okay, what about this other firm? It's, again, not one of my listings, but it's another one. And so the agents love it because they have a much better chance of selling a house to every single potential buyer because that buyer's going to buy something, whether it's their listing or any of the listings. So this was all great, except here was the problem. Even though now they could cooperate with each other, there was still confusion over who legally represented the client. The client didn't realize many times that even though that agent who was helping them find something to buy was being really nice and super helpful, they had no legal obligation to protect the client. That buyer agent wasn't even a buyer agent. What they were really officially called would be a subagent to the seller. Subagent to the seller. Hang on to that phrase. We will talk about it a lot. It applies today. Subagent to the seller. So, if you listed a house back then, you were the listing agent, the one who was hired to sell it. And then every other agent in the MLS would be officially classified as a subagent to your seller. What the heck does that mean? It means that really, for them to do it properly, if that buyer told them, yeah, okay, let's make an offer on this house for $33,000, but if they won't take that, I'll come on up to the $40,000 they're asking. If that buyer confided in the agent that's helping them show it and write the offer, that agent, as a subagent to the seller, was legally required to tell the seller, yes, we're offering $33,000, but my buyer will pay you $40,000. They probably didn't, because that's a good way that that buyer would fire them and say, forget you. You just told my secret. But my point is, the secret was not protected. They really had no legal ability to keep the secret, but you and I both know they probably did all the time. They probably acted like buyer agents when they really weren't, nor were they supposed to. But they did it anyway, because the buyer wouldn't call them back. I wouldn't. If I thought you were protecting me as a buyer agent for my best interest, and then I find out you're obligated to tell my negotiating secrets to the other side, I'm not going to like that too much. But unfortunately, that was the only option. Again, there was no buyer protection, period. Didn't exist. I'm just sure it was violated all upside down and backwards by everybody all the time. So that's just the way it was for a while. Fast forward all the way until 1991. Finally, a buyer assumed the agent they were working with was representing their own best interests and realized and found out that that was not even legally possible. The agent helping that buyer was only a sub-agent to the seller because there was no such thing as buyer agency. The agent had shown them multiple homes, worked with the buyer, and the buyer assumed they were representing their own best interest, but they were not. And so that buyer got mad about it. Maybe some secret was divulged, and the buyer sued the firm. The Adena Realty real estate firm still exists today, so they survived, but they ended up having to settle 3 lawsuits for $19.5 million from buyers that were ticked when they found out they weren't actually protected. There was no such thing as buyer agent, even though the agent acted like it. It didn't exist. That was in 1995. And this changed the whole industry. Just think about it. Until then, the only way an agent worked with a person was as a listing agent or as a sub-agent to all of those sellers. No buyer agency existed. All of a sudden, the laws changed because they needed to, and now we introduced buyer agency as an option. Well, now we have seller's agency like we always did, but now we have this new thing called buyer agency. What happens if a buyer calls your yard sign and wants you to write the offer for your listing? If there's buyer agency and there's seller agency, could you be the one agent in between them both? In other words, adding buyer's agency required that they also create this weird thing called dual agency. You ever heard of dual agency? That's when one firm represents both the buyer and the seller at the same time. How is it possible to take care of a seller's goals? What's the seller's premier goal? To get the house sold for the most money. In and of itself, that's typically what the seller wants to accomplish. What's the buyer's goal? To buy the house for the least possible money. Yes, there's terms and conditions and time frames and stuff that also enter in, but for the most part, exactly opposite goals. How can you as a broker represent both of those parties when they're reaching for different goals? It's allowable, but it requires that we get rid of one of those fiduciary duties that we're going to learn about in a minute. And I'll give you the spoiler. You can't be loyal to either one of them. If you're this weird thing called a dual agent in between buyer and seller, you can't tell the buyer the lowest the seller might be willing to take for the property. But you also can't tell the seller the most the buyer might be willing to pay for it. Besides that, you have to be honest and fair to both sides equally. You probably met the seller first because you listed the property with them. And then 3 weeks later, the buyer called you on an ad or a sign. And so now you're meeting that buyer, but if the buyer's okay with you being a dual agent and the seller has given you permission to be a dual agent and your firm has allowed you to be a dual agent and you're okay with doing it, then you can be this person. You can be a dual agent between the two parties. But the thing is, you've got to give up the loyalty to them. You can't tell each other's secrets to the other one, but you got to be like a mediator. Basically, you're less of an agent to each of them because you're in this dual agency role. We'll dig more into that in a minute, but the point is, it wasn't just buyer agency that came into the market in 1995. Dual agency also had to come into the market too, because it just was it just was a natural evolution. The situation arose that an agent with a listing got a buyer call them directly and they could operate and help both parties at the same time. So, 1996 was when Neil Pinder, entered into the real estate market. Brand new agency laws just from the year before. I didn't know any different. I just learned it from scratch, like you're learning this stuff from scratch today. So I had never done it the old way. To me, buyer agency always existed, even though I learned that it had just come about last year at that time. But I remember going to that my first firm I joined, and there were some old timers that were not thrilled at this new agency law. They were not happy that now we have buyer agency and dual agency, because what it requires then and now is that we spend time explaining it to the consumer. So we've got to stop everything at a certain point in the process and explain to the consumer, look, guys, there's this thing called buyer agency, seller agency, and also dual agency, and here's what it means, and what do you want to do? Here's what I offer. I'll do dual, or maybe you say I won't do it. I don't do it. You don't have to. You could choose not to, because you don't want to, because frankly, it can get ugly. It could get awkward. If one of those parties to the transaction, buyer or seller, get a feeling that you're not being fair to them, you're being more preferential to the other party, that's not good. You got to make sure they both feel like and trust you to handle this properly, and you're not giving either one an advantage over the other when you're a dual agent. So it's delicate, and it still exists. So these old timers in the business when I was brand new, fussing about these new disclosure laws. So I guess part of that point I'm making is you're going to have an advantage over people that have been in it for a while. You're going to know the most recent rules and laws. So take pride in that. Don't feel inferior. There's going to be some old dinosaur that says, how long have you been in the business? I've been doing it 20 years. And my first thought when I hear that is, well, you could have been doing it wrong for 20 years in a row. So don't brag about your 20 years. How good of an agent are you? You could act like an inexperienced agent 20 years, one after the other. I'm not impressed by duration. I'm impressed by by the person's behavior. Not even impressed by the sales. Because you could sell $10 million worth of property, but if you end up spending all of what you made on operating expenses, that shows me you're not a great business person. I don't want that life. I don't want to spend everything I make. I'd rather be lean and mean and sell a certain amount and keep more of my money, right? So there's more to all that than the brag and the ego out there. But 1950s, one person office. You went to that office to see what they had for sale. 1960s, they started sharing. The MLS was born. They cooperated. And then in the 1990s, 1995, the Edina lawsuit was settled, started and introduced buyer agency, and then by necessity, dual agency into our market. So, something called the common law of agency requires that licensees tell people how this stuff works. And I completely would not be surprised if some of you right now are looking at the screen and you're like, I kind of get it, but it still kind of makes no sense at all. And that is natural. It's okay. We will get there. But think how the consumer feels. You're making a concerted effort to understand this. The consumer just wants to buy a house or sell a house, and now you're springing all this explanation on them. So it gets a little tricky. You kind of have to develop a certain dialogue, a certain pitch, way to explain it to help them understand what their rights are and how you could choose to work for them and how they could choose to hire you. So there's a certain time in the process when you're required to bring this up, explaining the various ways that agency works, right? The buyer agency, seller agency, dual agency. And that time in the process at which you are required to bring this up is called first substantial contact. Write that one down. First substantial contact. You can't let them tell you their secrets without explaining to them that you don't work for them yet, giving them the ability and the choice to hire you. At which point, once they hire you, yes, then you can keep their confidentiality. But you can't just let them go on and babble and say, well, gosh, I'm really nervous about this buying thing. I've gotten pre-approved for $500, but I really want to pay only $350, and I'm here at your open house with this listing of yours, and your people are asking $400, but I like it so much I'd probably pay $475 or $500 because that's what I qualify. You better not let them go into all that. And that sounds a little extreme, but it's not far from what could happen. You're probably in this business to some degree because you work well with people. You like people, and they probably feel kind of at ease with you. You build rapport pretty easily, maybe. And so it's not unusual for somebody to like you sooner than they might like someone else. And that's going to serve you well in this business. So you have a responsibility like Spider-Man, right? With great power comes great responsibility. You have the power of rapport. So you have the responsibility of agency so as not to let them harm themselves by confiding in you until they understand that you're not their person yet. They haven't hired you yet. And that's what we do at this point of first substantial contact. We need to inform them about their choices. What are their options of hiring you? It has somewhat to do with your choices of how you want to make yourself available to them. So let's see what all that means. Let's talk about some terminology. North Carolina Real Estate Commission says that brokers in charge should have a written policy in place about what kind of agency is going to be offered. Some firms might have experienced dual agency where an agent works for both buyer and seller that just completely blew up. It was a disaster. People got mad. They felt like the agent was helping the buyer more than they were helping them, the seller, and they might have even sued over it. Some reason or other, a broker in charge of a firm might say, you know what, I don't want to go there again. So therefore, this firm never does dual agency. It's our policy, period. So your firm might not even let you offer it. It might be that your firm lets you offer dual agency, or buyer agency or seller agency. The firm dictates what sorts of agency relationships you're allowed to enforce. You're allowed to use. Most firms allow both buyers, working with buyers and working with sellers. But we'll get into some slides here in a minute that really go into, while they tend to offer both, if a firm wanted to specialize and only list properties and never work with buyers as buyer agent, they could choose to do it that way. Or if they only wanted to work with buyer agents and never list property and help sellers, they could choose that. I would find that maybe kind of foolish, because I think one leads to the other, and it would maybe leave half the money on the table sometimes. But the point is, a firm can choose, have a written policy. They should have a policy of how they're going to do agency, what they're going to allow, and also what the commission splits might be. How much are they going to pay you? We know that on a given sale, maybe the seller pays X% commission, some percentage of the sale price. Let's just say 5. And then maybe the buyer agent's portion of that 5 is half of it, maybe. It's always negotiable. So the buyer agent ends up doing all the work. They get a check at the closing from the attorney for 2.5% of the sale price, half of the 5, and they bring it back to the office and turn it in with their paperwork and say, here's my closing. It's all done. Give me my money. And the firm would then give them a portion of that. That's your split with your firm. However much of what you bring back from closing, you're going to share with them. It could be half, 50-50. It could be 80-20. It could be 90-10. It could be 100%. They give you all of it. Usually if they give you like all of it or really close to all of the commission, they're going to charge you quite a bit in a monthly fee, like a monthly desk fee. RE/MAX has programs like that let you keep most of the commission, but I worked there one time at one particular RE/MAX, and when I had a 95% split with them, got to keep 95% of that commission check, I had to pay $1,100 a month, no matter if I sold something that month or not. So that's a whole different ballgame. But most firms are somewhere between 60 and 80% that you get to keep from a particular check. Some firms might make you start at a 50-50 with the firm, and then you progress up. So as you get to like maybe you sell and make $16,000 in commission, for every other $2,000 more that you make that year, they'll bump your commission split up 2 or 3 or 4%. And so you can rise and start at 50 and make your way up to 70 or 80. And then at the start of the next year, it bumps back down. Who knows? There's all kinds of ways. That's one of the questions, one of the things you'll talk about when you interview firms. Some might just do, the last firm I was with before my own, might just do just a straight, I think it was 85-15. Whatever I brought in, he took 15% off the top and I kept 85. But that's what we're talking about with commission splits. It also applies to the split of the total commission between the two firms involved. So you're listing a property. The seller pays you as the listing firm 6% total commission, and you agree to pay maybe, let's say you pay 2.5% to the buyer agency firm and you keep 3.5%. Or you might do it even, split 50-50. That's another place where we split commission. So we're going to learn that commission split math, how to find out what the buyer agent makes, and then have to figure out what the purchase price was. You have to do some math backwards to work your way toward that. So we'll get into that too. When you see the word co-broke, co-brokerage, co-broke means two firms are involved. The listing firm is not the same firm as the one with the buyer agent. So not an in-house, that would be not an in-house sale. First of all, a good term, and I've been using this improperly the way we tend to do it out there in the wild, but for the purposes of this class, I'm going to try to stick to this because for your test, you need to realize that the firm is who the agency agreement is with. When a seller lists their home with you, they're not listing it with you, the person. They're listing it's between them and your firm. And then you're the representative of your firm that's carrying out the work. So the firm is the agent. Forget what you think about the word agent. You think about Jerry Maguire, or you think about a real estate person, human. But no, for our purposes, through the end of when the test happens and through all the way through PSI, what is an agent? It's not a human. It's a firm. The firm is the agent. The firm is the agent. That's how it will show up on the exam. So swap that in your brain. Imprint that in your mind. The firm is the agent. So therefore, here's some other terms. We've got agency, sub-agency, principal, client, and customer. And here's what it looks like. Agency is the relationship between the firm and the consumer, whether it's a client or a customer. We'll talk about that in a minute. So agency is the relationship itself. The agent, as we just saw, is the firm. Sub-agency is two possible definitions. Sub-agency, it could be the relationship between the firm and you, one of the brokers in the firm. So you are a sub-agent for your firm. You're a sub-agent for the agent because the agent is the firm, as we just learned. This is a terrible time of night to get into this because your brain's probably upside down and backwards and flipped all around, but we're going to push through. We're almost done tonight. We're going to pick it up fresh tomorrow. So bear with me. We will be coming back around to this again and again because it is so important. Sub-agency, the relationship of you within your firm. Another way we could see sub-agency, we kind of already talked about. That thing called seller's sub-agency. And it still exists. In fact, all brokers are sub-agents to all sellers until they're not. When do they stop being a sub-agent to a seller? When they are hired as a buyer agent for a specific property. At that point, they're not a sub-agent to that seller, but they're still a sub-agent to all those other ones. It'll make more sense later. Hang in there. I know it's confusing. Principal is a party to the transaction, either the buyer or the seller. The client is your principal, the one you're working for, the one you're doing the most work for. So if you list a property for sale, the seller is your client. The seller is also your principal. The seller is a principal to the transaction. The buyer in that transaction is to you called a customer. Customer is not as good as a client. You don't owe as much to the customer as you do to the client. You owe more fiduciary duties like obedience, loyalty, disclosure, confidentiality, accounting, and reasonable skill and care. We'll get into those in a minute later tomorrow. But the customer is the person on the other side of the transaction from you. If you're the listing agent, your customer is the buyer. If you're the buyer's agent, your customer is the seller. Does that make sense? So agency is that fiduciary relationship when a firm is hired or authorized to act on behalf of either the buyer or the seller, one of the principals. It's what makes real estate so different from selling cars or selling anything else. When you walk onto the car lot, there is no buyer agency. There's only that salesperson who works for the dealership. They're the seller's agent, essentially. You're going in there as an unrepresented buyer. With real estate, we've got representation available to both sides. And sometimes it's the same person or the same firm for both parties. Why are we called real estate agents? Not because we sell property, but because we represent clients. Right? We're representing people to accomplish the selling of the property. We're an agent for someone. What is this thing called a sub-agent? Here's one of the ways. If the firm is an agent, then the broker within the firm is a sub-agent who represents that firm. The sub-agent to the agent. The firm is the agent. And that pretty much is the same thing. We're summing that up here. The principal, again, is one of the clients. The principal or the client hires the firm as an agent to act on their behalf And then one of the brokers within that firm is the one that they're actually working with. So that client principal could be a buyer, it could be a seller, it could be a landlord, the owner of a property for rent, could be a tenant. Those are all types of clients you might have. You're the broker or the sub-agent to the agent, which is the firm, and the buyer, seller, landlord, tenant are hiring your firm, and then you're the one carrying out the work. And it's all about this responsibility we have, this word fiduciary. The Real Estate Commission in the Real Estate Manual says a fiduciary is somebody who acts in a position of trust. More than just real estate, it could be a guardian, working on behalf or representing an underage person. Sold a house one time. It was a gentleman who passed away. He had 3 daughters who were of age and 1 son who was 12. So I had to interact with each of those daughters. If they had been married, I would have had to get their signatures and their spouses. But then I had to interact with the little 12-year-old's mom, the baby mama, because they weren't together. He died. She was the divorced wife, and she was the child's guardian, right? So people in a position of trust could be attorneys, could be brokers, could be executors of an estate. Our fiduciary duty as a broker or any kind of fiduciary stands in the place of the client. There's different levels of this in real estate. So we have a duty to look out for that client's interest above everyone else's, including ours. We've got to put the client's needs first above our own. And we often have to protect our client from even something they want to do that's stupid. We got to tell them that's a terrible idea. You think it's a good idea. It's what you want to do, but here's the problem with it. So we got to protect them from everybody, including themselves, and tell them not just what they want to hear, but what they need to hear. It's typically someone's most complex financial transaction, the biggest chunk of money they're responsible for quite often. I think these numbers are going to change because of how crazy the market's been, but the average client buys or sells every 5 to 7 years. I have a feeling with people buying so far at the top of the market over asking price these last couple of years, they're going to probably be staying put for longer than 5 to 7 years. We're basically a counselor. The average agent sells houses 6 to 8 times a year. But again, who wants to be average? There's all kinds of ways to do this, and that doesn't mean anything really. But just to put it in perspective, this is a big deal for people. Finally, we'll part on this point. These are the fiduciary duties that we owe to our client. We owe them, and it's the acronym OLDCAR. The acronym is obedience. We'll dig into each of these individually, but we've got to be obedient to our clients' wishes, but not just to anything they ask of us, because they might ask us to do something illegal. And they might ask us to do that because they know it's illegal, or they might ask us to do it because they have no idea it's not allowed. It's on us to help educate them, help them understand, no, I can't do that because that's not allowed. It's not legal. So their lawful obedience is what we're obligated to follow. That's a big distinction. Make sure you write that one down. Lawful obedience. And we owe them loyalty. We're devoted to them. We owe them disclosure. Whatever we learn about the property or the situation, we have to disclose to our client. Then we need to keep their secrets. We're not going to tell the seller what our client, that's the buyer, is willing to pay, the most they're willing to pay. We're not going to tell the buyer the lowest the seller's willing to take if we're the seller's agent. And we're responsible for the money, due diligence check, earnest money check, and the paperwork. Got to take good care of all that stuff and be proper, and then also reasonable skill and care. We need to know what we're doing. We need to know what forms to use, and we need to know the process. And when you get out in the wild, you're going to learn that through your training with your broker and your mentor and whatnot. So we'll pick back up tomorrow night. Put your name in the chat for me, and I'll see you then. Have a great night.